At the beginning of Chapter 1, a bowl crashed to the ground, spilling its contents everywhere. Rain poured heavily as a voice shouted that they had finally caught him. One of the men mocked the boy for having the nerve to steal from them, calling him nothing more than a filthy street rat. The boy lay silently on the ground without responding. The man declared that the boy was about to learn his lesson, and the group began stomping on him mercilessly. Another man pushed forward, demanding a turn to kick him as well. That day marked the first time the protagonist had failed as a thief, and deep down, he prepared himself for death. Even while being beaten, he glared sharply at the men. One of them angrily questioned the look in his eyes, while another asked if the boy had a problem. In his mind, the protagonist bitterly admitted that he did have a problem. He was starving. Hunger had driven him to the brink of death, leaving him no choice but to steal in order to survive. As he was hurled against a wall, bitter thoughts filled his mind. While orphans like him struggled every day just to stay alive, others spent their lives in warm and comfortable homes. Those fortunate people were called nobles, individuals blessed from birth. Ever since he could remember, the protagonist had survived by digging through garbage and enduring endless hunger. There was no way people like the nobles could ever understand his suffering. One of the men charged at him with murderous intent, shouting for him to die. The protagonist wondered if this was truly the end for him. Although he had long prepared himself for death, he realized he was tired of constantly losing. He no longer wanted to run away. At that moment, a magic circle suddenly appeared beneath him. Rain continued to pour as a brilliant light burst from his body. In his heart, the protagonist swore that he would never run from the world again. One of the attackers recoiled as his face was grazed by the sudden power. Terrified, the man questioned whether the boy had just used magic. He could not understand how a mere brat could possess such authority, since only nobles were capable of wielding magic. Though there had been rumors of commoners suddenly awakening magical abilities, he never believed those stories were true. Staring at the protagonist, the man could only describe the sight as hideous and unnatural. Taking advantage of the confusion, the protagonist forced himself to his feet and fled into the night. Panting heavily, he instinctively understood that if he were caught again, he would surely lose his life. With no destination in mind, he continued running blindly through the darkness. Days passed one after another, and eventually winter arrived. Snow began to fall as the protagonist sat alone in a narrow alley, wrapped in a worn coat. His vision gradually dimmed, and his thoughts became hazy. He quietly accepted that this might be where his life would end. Just as his eyes were about to close completely, he heard a voice speaking to him. The man remarked that the protagonist looked to be in a truly pitiful state. Standing before him, the stranger calmly listed his injuries: broken ribs, severe malnourishment, and serious frostbite. The man noted that the boy had probably lost feeling in his fingertips long ago. Confused and barely conscious, the protagonist wondered whose voice he was hearing as he struggled to lift his eyes and see the figure standing before him. The mysterious man offered the protagonist two choices. He could either die on the roadside like a stray dog or follow the man and live as a killer. At the time, the protagonist did not fully understand what the man meant by becoming a killer, but deep in his heart, he knew one thing for certain: if he remained beneath that freezing winter sky, he would never rise again. With trembling strength, he reached out and grabbed the man's hand. The man smirked and declared that they now had a deal. He then asked the boy for his name. The protagonist hesitated before trying to answer, only for violent coughing fits to interrupt him. Even so, the man insisted on hearing his name despite clearly noticing that the boy's voice was failing. Gritting his teeth and gathering the last of his strength, the protagonist finally managed to speak. His name was Aruz. The man's eyes widened in surprise upon hearing it. Before anything else could be said, Aruz lost consciousness. Holding the boy's hand firmly, the man quietly declared that from that day onward, Aruz would be his son. 10 years earlier, if that old man had not found him on the street, Aruz would have died alone in the cold. That decision eventually led to the present day. A man sprinted desperately through the streets, shouting at someone behind him to stay back. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out. A hooded figure fired without hesitation, and the fleeing man collapsed as the bullet struck him. The hooded assassin was Aruz Wilzard, a sorcerer who operated within the shadows of the city. Time and location meant little to him. Wherever the stench of blood and smoke lingered, Aruz could always be found carrying out his work. Witnesses could only stare in shock, questioning whether what they had seen was real. They barely managed to react to the hooded man's unnatural movements before Aruz eliminated them as well. Aruz followed orders without question, killing complete strangers as part of the life the old man had given him. This city was known as Parakinos, the Black City, a place overflowing with humanity's darkest desires. Corruption and violence wrapped around the city like a curse. In order to maintain public order, the authorities had formed contracts with a nameless guild of sorcerers who worked in secrecy. On another assignment, a man stood before Aruz with a bitter smile. He admitted that he never expected to be cornered so quickly. The target was Gregory Scanner, a 38-year-old noble holding the rank of double, a 2-star aristocrat deeply involved in the illegal slave trade. Despite being arrested 4 separate times, Gregory had always escaped punishment through heavy bribery and corruption. His crimes had made him a person of interest to the organization. Lighting a cigarette, Gregory remarked that he had heard the rumors about a ruse. He spoke of the assassin known throughout the underworld as the Nighthawk, a man who moved swiftly, killed silently, and vanished into the darkness without leaving a trace once the job was complete. Gregory noted that the title, Nighthawk, came from a ruse being an assassin who carried a royal warrant. Although that was the name others used to describe him, Aruz himself disliked the title. Aruz believed that a truly skilled assassin should remain completely unknown. The moment an assassin gained a reputation or a title, it meant he was still inexperienced. To him, having a name was proof that he had yet to master the art of secrecy. Gregory Scanner let out a bitter laugh as he remarked that the infamous Nighthawk had finally appeared before him. Accepting his fate, Gregory cursed his own bad luck and urged Aruz to finish the job quickly. He had heard countless rumors claiming that Aruz could kill a man in an instant. Watching Gregory's theatrical behavior, Aruz thought to himself that the noble enjoyed dramatics far too much. However, ever since entering the room, Aruz had sensed that something was wrong. Gregory was a noble targeted by the organization, yet there was no visible security anywhere in sight. The silence itself felt unnatural, almost as though Gregory had intentionally lured him there. Suddenly, armed men emerged from hiding all around the room. One mockingly claimed they would kindly let Aruz leave this world alive before pulling out a pistol and ordering him to die. Another cursed him while raising his weapon, and soon multiple guns were aimed directly at him. Aruz immediately understood the situation. Gregory had hidden his guards in preparation for an ambush. Calmly removing his hood, Aruz watched as the men opened fire. The instant the bullets were released, he chanted an enhancement spell. Using the School of Enhancement invocation alongside his steelskin magic, Aruz dashed through the room with terrifying speed. The guards were overwhelmed before they could react, their bodies collapsing one after another. To Aruz, flashy magic was unnecessary when it came to killing. A simple 9mm bullet was more than enough to end a human life. After neutralizing the guards, Aruz removed his mask and coldly remarked that Gregory's entire plan had just fallen apart. Stepping closer, he sarcastically called the situation a shame. Gregory forced out a nervous laugh, unable to believe what he had witnessed. Trembling violently, he cursed under his breath and hurriedly pulled out his own gun. He fired desperately at Aruz, but the assassin effortlessly dodged the attack. Gregory could only pant in fear as Aruz calmly raised his weapon and pointed it directly between the noble's eyes. Aruz explained that if a trap like this were enough to kill him, he never would have survived 10 years in the criminal underworld. Gregory froze the moment he finally saw Aruz's face clearly. To his disbelief, the feared Nighthawk was nothing more than a young man, a mere brat in his eyes. Aruz calmly admitted that Gregory was right. A gunshot echoed through the room. In this world, magic was regarded as a sacred mystery, a power reserved only for those born into chosen bloodlines. Ordinary people could never hope to wield such authority. However, there existed one exception to that rule: the cursed bloodline. At the beginning of Chapter 2, a gunshot signaled the end of a mission. A man collapsed onto the floor as Aruz calmly thought that everything there was finished. All that remained was to leave. However, before he could move on, a loud scream echoed through the area. Moments later, a man burst through the wall and rushed inside. Aruz turned toward the newcomer as the man enthusiastically announced that backup had arrived. The man was Saj, also known as Buffalo, a member of the Sorcerer's Guild. Unfazed, Aruz replied that there was no need for backup. At that moment, the target unexpectedly stood back up while gripping a knife. Saj stared in confusion, but before he could react, Aruz fired another shot and killed the man instantly. Aruz remarked that allowing targets to chase after them would only become troublesome, and with that, he told Saj they were leaving. Saj hesitated for a moment before reluctantly agreeing. Far away, in the black city of Parakinos, the crowds that thrived even during the darkest hours had earned the city another title: the Nightless City. In that place, race, nationality, age, and gender meant nothing. Dressed in black, anyone could survive and make a living there. As Aruz and Saj leaped across the rooftops, Saj admitted that something had been bothering him for quite some time. Aruz sighed and asked what it was this time. Saj questioned why Aruz still insisted on using what looked like a toy gun. Considering Aruz was a powerful sorcerer, Saj believed it would be far easier for him to eliminate targets with magic instead. Aruz glanced at the weapon and repeated Saj's words with mild amusement. Saj continued, saying that a weapon like that could hardly be worth more than scrap metal to someone like Aruz. Aruz admitted that magic was indeed convenient. A sorcerer only needed their own body, and with enough training, magic could become far more effective than any firearm. However, he explained that using magic always left traces behind. Confused, Saj asked what he meant. Aruz explained that magical energy was essentially concentrated personal information. Because of that, he preferred to leave as little evidence behind as possible. He also added that relying on magic for assassinations was already outdated. Modern anti-sorcerer technology had evolved far beyond that. Before Aruz could finish explaining, he suddenly paused and muttered, "Speak of the devil." Saj looked puzzled, but when he glanced behind them, he noticed several strange flying objects approaching. They resembled robotic birds. Alarmed, Saj demanded to know what they were. Aruz calmly explained that they were autonomous tracking devices designed to detect traces of magic and pursue their targets relentlessly. They were cutting-edge anti-magic weapons. He guessed the machines had likely followed the magical signal from Saj's earlier spell. Although Saj admitted he did not fully understand, he decided it did not matter as long as he could shoot them down. Stopping in his tracks, he aimed at the flying machines and fired his burning bullet magic. In Aruz's eyes, Saj's abilities were actually impressive. It was no surprise considering Saj had joined the guild at such a young age. Even so, Saj was shocked when the machines effortlessly dodged his attacks. Aruz told him there was no point. Since the devices could sense magical energy, Saj had no chance of hitting them with magic like that. Saj stared in disbelief, and asked how they were supposed to destroy the machines at all. Aruz realized they would get nowhere if they continued attacking recklessly. The fastest solution was much simpler. Raising his gun toward the flying devices, he silently decided to use the machine's own abilities against them. Saj was about to ask what Aruz was doing when Aruz suddenly opened fire. To Aruz, it was the most reliable method. He estimated the distance to the targets at roughly 100 meters as the bullets sped toward the machines. Watching carefully, Aruz thought to himself that the first 2 bullets were infused with magical energy. Their purpose was not to destroy the devices immediately, but to lure them exactly where he wanted them to go. The remaining 6 bullets were ordinary rounds fired with the sole purpose of killing the target. Aruz understood the weakness of the tracking devices well. While the machines were highly sensitive to magical energy and capable of evading magic-based attacks with ease, outside of that function they were practically mindless. As the bullets struck their targets, explosions erupted in the air one after another. Saj watched in astonishment as all 6 devices detonated simultaneously. Aruz calmly asked Saj what he thought now. Even lowly weapons like guns had their own usefulness, did they not? With the tracking devices destroyed, the targets had been completely eliminated. At the beginning of Chapter 3, the adventurers' tavern known as Yggdrasil stood hidden deep within the alleys of the Black City. The establishment was a familiar gathering place for many members of the guild. As Aruz entered, one of the servers warmly welcomed him, while another adventurer greeted him with praise for the work he had done earlier. Aruz casually replied that he had simply been in top form lately before noticing that his old man was already drunk again. An old man nearby burst into laughter and remarked that even the boss had struggled with today's target. Confident that the organization would be pleased with the outcome, he repeatedly patted Aruz on the back. Aruz could immediately tell that the man was completely wasted. The drunk old man then loudly ordered the server to bring Aruz a drink as well. The drunkard was Genos Wilzard, the man who was legally Aruz's father. Genos served the organization as a liaison, acting as the connection between the group and the government. In the past, he had once worked as an assassin under the alias Golden Lion, but he eventually retired from the field and was reassigned to Aruz's organization instead. Calling out to Aruz, Genos remarked that it had already been 10 years since Aruz first began carrying out field work. He then asked if Aruz still remembered how many people he had killed over the years. Aruz answered honestly that he no longer knew, having lost count long ago. Genos went on to list the kinds of people Aruz had eliminated throughout that decade: nobles, royalty, mages, and holy knight. Many of them had been personally finished off by Aruz himself. Growing impatient, Aruz told Genos to get to the point and asked when the next assignment would come. To Aruz's surprise, Genos revealed that he was considering refusing jobs for a while. Shocked, Aruz immediately questioned whether Genos intended to send him to school. Genos responded by asking who else he would send, wondering if Aruz had somehow become drunk as well. When Aruz demanded to know why, Genos explained that possessing a sorcerer's qualification was invaluable for anyone planning to survive in the city. Among noble companies, credibility meant everything. He added that Saj had already earned his own license, making Aruz feel the sting of comparison. Genos bluntly remarked that this meant people had even less faith in Aruz than they did in Saj. After taking another drink, Genos continued more seriously. He pointed out that Aruz was probably already aware that ever since the incident 3 years earlier, work had become increasingly difficult to find. The Reverse Recrown, the Black City's largest anti-government organization, had left behind deep resentment because of their actions during that incident. Even after the conflict was resolved, the organization had gradually been hunted down and diminished until it eventually disappeared entirely. In the end, its destruction was believed to have improved public safety within the Black City. Genos remarked that, at this rate, the world was steadily moving closer to peace, and an unlicensed sorcerer like Aruz might soon find himself without any way to earn a living. Aruz was left puzzled by those words. He had almost forgotten that he was already 15 years old that year. Normally, boys his age would have been attending school rather than working as assassins. Aruz immediately refused the idea and asked what Genos would do if that was his answer. Genos simply apologized before bluntly informing him that this was an order, and Aruz had no right to refuse it. Inwardly, Aruz sighed in frustration, thinking that the greatest drawback of belonging to the organization was the absolute nature of its orders. In the end, Aruz reluctantly acknowledged that he understood. At that moment, someone tapped him from behind. A drunken man grinned and asked if Aruz was enjoying a good drink. Aruz could only think that, aside from his old man, he seemed to be attracting all the wrong kinds of people that day. Nearby, a young waitress nervously called out to the drunk man, telling him that he was disturbing the other customers. Enraged, the man suddenly slapped her and demanded to know if she was calling him a nuisance. The tray of food in her hands scattered across the floor. Before the girl could collapse, someone caught and supported her from behind. It was Aruz. The drunken man bitterly complained that no matter where he went, people looked down on him because he was a commoner. He shouted that they themselves were commoners too, yet they treated him differently. According to him, unless someone was a noble, they could not even receive proper service. The frightened girl tried to explain that she had not meant any offense, but the man ignored her. Declaring that he was a paying customer too, he cursed at her and demanded more alcohol. Watching the scene, Aruz quietly reflected that men dissatisfied with their commoner status were hardly uncommon among noble companies. He understood the man's frustration well enough. The world itself was unfair. Even so, Aruz believed that such resentment was no excuse to lash out at innocent people. As the man staggered forward and raised the bottle in his hand, Genos silently signaled Aruz. Aruz immediately understood what that meant, another executive order. Stepping forward, Aruz grabbed the man and calmly declared that their duty was to keep the city safe. The drunk man looked startled. In the next instant, Aruz used magic to shatter the bottle in the man's hand, reducing it to fragments. The man's eyes widened in shock. Aruz then cast enchantment magic to strengthen his arm, throwing the man off balance. Taking advantage of the opening, he spun the man around and slammed him to the ground in one swift motion, pinning him there as the man continued cursing furiously. Genos casually praised Aruz for the unpaid overtime, before mentioning that he had left some paperwork behind for him. He told Aruz to look through it later, explaining that it contained a list of schools where he still had a chance of being admitted. After thanking the staff for the meal, Genos prepared to leave. The waitress quietly thanked Aruz for helping her. As everything settled down, Aruz found himself overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. The realization that he was actually about to start school made his head ache. Although he understood that Genos was worried about his future, it was still difficult for him to accept. At the beginning of Chapter 4, Aruz stood quietly in his room, already dressed in his suit. It had been a gift from his father, who proudly claimed to have tailored it himself. Looking at him, Genos remarked that Aruz made a convincing noble. As Aruz prepared to leave, his thoughts drifted toward school. Spring had arrived, the season when new life blossomed, and it had already been 2 months since his old man assigned him the task of enrolling in an academy. The setting was Midgard, the royal capital located beside the Black City and known as the largest city in the entire country. Aruz found himself walking through the suburbs of the capital, observing the bustling surroundings as he made his way forward. When he looked up, the grand sight of the Royal Academy of Magic came into view. Among all the schools available to him, this was the academy he had chosen to attend, and there were 2 reasons for that decision. The first was the tuition. The academy's fees were less than a tenth of those charged by other schools. It struck Aruz as ironic that an institution attended almost exclusively by the wealthy was entirely funded by taxpayers. The second reason was its location. The academy stood within walking distance of the capital and was only a 10-minute trip away from the apartment in the slums. Naturally, a school with so many advantages attracted countless aspiring students. As Aruz passed by the entrance, he overheard students gossiping among themselves. One pointed at a certain student and asked if he was the son of the Lewis Buster family. Another commented in amazement that the Royal Academy truly was incredible, as if all the great names of high society had gathered there. Hearing this, Aruz realized that nearly everyone around him was a noble except for himself. Distinguishing nobles from commoners was simple enough. Nobles wore medals beneath their collars, while ordinary people lacked them. Of course, there were some who deliberately hid their status and blended in with the masses, though such individuals often had connections to the underworld. Suddenly, a loud voice cut through the atmosphere. Someone angrily shouted, demanding to know how a lowly star could dare talk back. The surrounding students quickly gathered, sensing trouble. Aruz wondered if a fight had broken out. He had no desire to get involved so soon after arriving, but his attention was drawn to a girl being humiliated by several students. They sneered that she was standing on the sacred grounds of the Royal Academy of Magic and declared that such a place was no home for trash like her. Another student argued back in disbelief, asking what that was even supposed to mean. There was no rule in the Academy's books stating that one-star individuals were forbidden from enrolling. One of the boys laughed before explaining that, while such rules were not explicitly written anywhere, the existence of the noble class itself made the hierarchy obvious. He proudly declared that 3-star nobles like themselves were the elite, possessing vast territories and powerful trade networks. Beneath them were the 2-star nobles, who formed the middle class with their own private holdings. At the very bottom were 1-star nobles like the girl, whom he described as worthless nobles with no land of their own. According to him, everyone attending the academy belonged to either the 2-star or 3-star ranks. He insisted that it was about more than simple written regulations and claimed that this was the true meaning of noblesse oblige. Another student scoffed at the girl, remarking that a mere 1-star noble daring to talk back to Lord Diluc should have known her place. Someone else mockingly advised her to take the hint and leave. Diluc himself then addressed the girl directly. He told her that, in their society, stars meant everything. Those with fewer stars would always stand beneath those with more. To him, the fact that she had not even learned such a basic truth during her upbringing was simply pathetic. The girl could not bring herself to respond. Aruz noticed how completely she had withdrawn into herself under the pressure of the ridicule. As he walked past the crowd, he glanced toward another girl nearby and casually asked if something was wrong. The short-haired girl nervously explained that the girl being harassed was an old friend of hers who had been targeted the moment she arrived. Hearing that, Aruz concluded that the girl had simply become a victim of an arrogant blonde noble who expected everything to go exactly his way, a flaw he considered common among the high nobility. Diluc then pressed a hand against the girl's forehead. She weakly asked him to stop, but Diluc only mocked her further, amused that she still dared to talk back to him. He warned that defying a 3-star noble would cost her dearly, though he smugly added that he might reconsider if she agreed to become his woman. In Aruz's mind, the entire situation was absurd. Trying to flirt with girls right before an academy exam hardly matched the noble ideals Diluc had been preaching about moments earlier. So much for noblesse oblige. The short-haired girl looked stunned when Aruz suddenly stepped forward. Without hesitation, he slipped between Diluc and the girl, politely excusing himself as he asked if they could move aside. The surrounding students were shocked by the interruption. Meanwhile, Aruz simply thought to himself that he had no time to waste on what looked like a lover's quarrel. One student immediately noticed his collar and pointed out that Aruz had no stars at all. Another exclaimed in disbelief, wondering why a commoner was even there in the first place. Hearing their reactions, Aruz quietly wondered if commoners were truly that rare. To him, having so many nobles gathered together in one place seemed far stranger. At the start of Chapter 5, the surrounding students were stunned to discover that Aruz had no stars at all. Diluc scoffed in disgust, declaring that the day had become truly disgraceful. In his eyes, dealing with a mere 1-star noble had already been irritating enough, but now even a commoner dared to criticize him. Diluc sneered at Aruz and demanded to know what a commoner thought he was doing there in the first place. Aruz calmly replied that he had simply come to take the academy entrance exam. Pulling out his admission ticket, numbered 298, he asked what other reason there could possibly be. The nobles around them were left speechless. One questioned whether Aruz was actually serious, while another exclaimed in disbelief that a commoner intended to take the exam. Someone else even wondered if such a thing was allowed at all. Aruz understood their confusion. The Royal Academy of Magic was one of the few institutions that officially did not discriminate based on class, allowing anyone to take the entrance examination. However, despite that policy, it seemed that not a single commoner had ever successfully passed before. Diluc could hardly believe what he was hearing. To him, the idea of a commoner attempting to enter the sacred academy was outrageous. He felt deeply humiliated by the mere presence of someone like Aruz. Hearing this, Aruz inwardly sighed. To think that Diluc considered this humiliation only showed how sheltered his life must have been. Unable to tolerate the situation any longer, Diluc suddenly drew his sword and ordered Aruz to prepare himself. He declared that Aruz would soon learn to fear the power of the noble class. The surrounding students eagerly encouraged Diluc, shouting for him to make Aruz pay for his disrespect. Others muttered that Aruz had dared to defy the nobility, while some simply yelled for him to leave because he did not belong there. Despite the escalating tension, Aruz remained calm. He casually warned Diluc that drawing a sword in the middle of the street was dangerous. Diluc angrily snapped back, telling Aruz not to order him around and insulting him once again as a commoner. He then proclaimed that he would end Aruz right then and there. When Aruz still did not move, Diluc mocked him further, asking if his legs were as poor and useless as the rest of him. Aruz quietly muttered how much he hated people like that. Inwardly, however, he remained composed. Diluc's thrust lacked any true killing intent, making it easy for Aruz to respond. Silently, he activated the School of Enhancement using durability enhancement. To everyone's shock, Diluc's sword was stopped cold by nothing more than a single piece of paper. Diluc stared in disbelief at the scene before him. Meanwhile, Aruz could not help but think that the paper quality at noble schools was surprisingly impressive. More importantly, he concluded that Diluc's understanding of magic still had a very long way to go. Aruz then calmly looked at Diluc and casually asked what was wrong. Aruz casually remarked that he thought Diluc had claimed he was going to end him. Hearing this only further enraged Diluc, who cursed furiously and demanded to know how much longer Aruz intended to make a fool out of him. Diluc continued launching attack after attack, but Aruz effortlessly avoided every strike. The surrounding students stared in shock as Diluc's sword thrusts failed to land even once. Among the crowd, the bullied girl watched in confusion. She could not fully understand what was happening before her eyes, but one thing had already become clear to her: Aruz was incredibly strong. Meanwhile, Diluc grew increasingly desperate. He cursed under his breath, unable to understand why he could not defeat Aruz. He could tell that Aruz had become slightly more serious during the fight, yet it was obvious he was still holding back. Diluc could not comprehend what Aruz was supposedly afraid of. Aruz, however, saw no reason to prolong the confrontation. Inwardly, he decided it was time to end the nuisance. Shouting for Aruz to die, Diluc swung his sword once more. At that instant, Aruz activated the School of Body Strengthening, focusing specifically on finger strengthening. He calmly brought his hand close to Diluc's ear and snapped his fingers. The next moment, Diluc collapsed to the ground. Panicked and furious, Diluc demanded to know what Aruz had done to him. Aruz casually thought to himself that it had been nothing more than a simple finger snap. To Diluc's shock, however, his body refused to move properly. Aruz calmly explained that he had merely paralyzed Diluc's semicircular canal and assured him that he would recover shortly. The students watching the fight could only stare in disbelief at what had just happened. In Aruz's mind, the matter was already settled. One troublesome nuisance had been dealt with, and there was no reason for him to stay any longer. As Aruz turned to leave, the bullied girl attempted to call out to him, but he continued walking without stopping. Beside her, the short-haired girl hurried over and asked if she was all right. Meanwhile, Diluc remained on the ground clutching his head in humiliation and confusion. Thus, Aruz made his unforgettable entrance into the Royal Academy of Magic. At the beginning of Chapter 6, the students were led to the assessment area, a massive expanse of land dedicated entirely to training. As the examinees took in the sight, someone suddenly called out to Aruz, asking if he could spare a moment of his time. It was the same girl who had been bullied earlier. She approached him cautiously and asked if he was the one from the school gates earlier that day. Aruz asked how he could help her, and the girl introduced herself as Rina. She explained that she wanted to thank him for helping her earlier. At her words, Aruz's eyes widened slightly, though he gave no immediate response. Deep in thought, he wondered if he had met her somewhere before, or if he was simply overthinking things. Rina noticed his strange reaction and looked puzzled. Aruz quickly told her not to worry about it. Rina then introduced the short-haired girl standing beside her. The girl greeted Aruz politely and introduced herself as Rua, an old friend of Rina's. Rua then shyly asked if it would be all right to know his name. Aruz introduced himself, causing Rua to blush faintly. Aruz then asked if the two of them were both one-star nobles. Rua laughed nervously and admitted that they had both been worried about whether it was truly possible for one-star nobles to pass the entrance exam. However, after seeing Aruz earlier, they had found a little courage. Rina added that it was already rare enough for commoners to even attempt the academy entrance exam. Curious, Aruz asked if being a one-star noble placed them at a disadvantage during the examinations. Rua and Rina exchanged uneasy looks before Rina explained that only a handful of one-star nobles had ever managed to pass. Rua added that if they wanted to succeed, they would likely need to demonstrate overwhelming power. Before the conversation could continue, a man standing atop a podium called for silence and ordered all examinees to gather at the central square. The students quickly assembled before him. The man introduced himself as Bobahara, the proctor of the Academy's transfer and entrance examinations. He welcomed them and stated that the Academy had been founded upon the principles of meritocracy. Because of that, he had no intention of giving them an ordinary written exam. Instead, their success or failure would be determined through 2 practical tests. Bobahara then directed everyone's attention toward a target set up in the distance. He explained that if they could strike the target with magic, they would pass. If they failed to hit it, they would fail the test. According to him, the rules were simple. Hearing this, Aruz silently questioned the absurdity of the challenge. To him, simply hitting a target with magic sounded far too easy. Bobahara continued by explaining that each examinee would be given 3 attempts to activate their magic and strike the target. Aruz remained unconvinced. Surely, anyone capable of using magic should have no trouble hitting a target. However, the mood among the students quickly changed when one examinee protested, asking if Bobahara was joking. The target was positioned an unbelievable distance away. Another student remarked that this was the Royal Academy of Magic, and that its entrance examination was notoriously difficult. Hearing this, Aruz could not help but wonder what they were even talking about. In his mind, there was no such thing as a stationary target in actual combat. He failed to see the purpose of testing someone's ability against a target that would never move. Once again, he found himself unable to understand the way nobles thought. Even so, the astonishingly low-level entrance exam began. One after another, the students attempted to hit the distant target with their magic. Some barely missed, others managed to get slightly closer, and a few proudly celebrated after clearing the first stage. As Aruz observed them, he questioned what kind of magic they were even using. He could hardly tell. Worse still, each of them needed nearly 20 seconds just to form a magic circle. In a real battle, that would simply hand an enemy a 20-second opportunity to strike. At that moment, Aruz realized he had vastly overestimated the abilities of his peers. The sorcerers he had grown up watching in the underworld were true professionals employed by high-ranking nobles. Compared to them, these children, who had lived sheltered lives without ever experiencing real conflict, possessed fighting abilities that barely amounted to anything. When Rina and Rua took their turns, the surrounding students praised them in amazement, wondering if the two girls were truly the same age as everyone else. In Aruz's opinion, however, they were the only examinees present who could even be considered passable. Bubuhara himself commented that their performance was not bad at all, though he added with disappointment that such talent belonged to mere one-star nobles. Soon after, Bubuhara called for the next examinee. It was the final participant. Exam number 398, Aruz. As Aruz stepped forward, Bubuhara loudly mocked him, calling him the insolent commoner who had dared to set foot inside the academy. He then declared that Aruz would only be allowed a single attempt if he wished to proceed to the next stage. He had only one chance to pass the test. The students murmured among themselves, some commenting that the administrator was being unnecessarily harsh. Another remarked that it could not be helped, since educating insolent commoners was supposedly one of a noble's duties. Bubuhara then asked Aruz if he wished to back out while he still had the chance. Aruz calmly looked toward the target and declared that he would complete the test. However, deep down, he understood that simply hitting the target would not be enough. If he performed at an ordinary level, the harassment against him would likely continue. Though he preferred not to stand out too much because of the nature of his work, it seemed that if he truly wished to pass, he would have no choice but to display overwhelming power. Without hesitation, Aruz cast a fireball and launched it toward the target. The moment it struck, a massive explosion erupted across the field. The students instinctively flinched in shock. Rua stared in disbelief and called out to Rina, pointing out that while everyone else had struggled to form their magic circles, Aruz had done something impossible. Her voice trailed off as the realization fully sank in. Confused, Rina asked what she meant. Rua, still stunned, exclaimed that there had been no sign of a magic circle at all. At the beginning of Chapter 7, the students were left in complete shock by the massive explosion caused by Aruz's attack. Voices erupted all around the examination grounds as the students struggled to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Some questioned what kind of explosion it had been, while others exclaimed in disbelief, wondering if they were truly being told that such power had come from a simple fireball spell. Several students began pointing toward Aruz's feet, urging the others to look carefully. One student asked if anyone had seen a magic circle appear at all, while another muttered that incantationless magic was supposed to be nothing more than an urban legend. Meanwhile, Aruz calmly reflected on the misunderstanding. In truth, incantationless magic referred to casting magic without the use of a magic circle, but that was not what he had done. He had simply used ordinary magic through a standard magic circle. The only difference was that his activation speed had been reduced to a mere tenth of a second. To students with no real combat experience, however, it would naturally appear as though no magic circle had been used at all. Bubuhara suddenly demanded to know what Aruz thought he was doing. He declared that Aruz could not fool him so easily. According to Bubuhara, there was no possible way a commoner like Aruz could use magic of that level without a magic circle, meaning it had to be some form of trickery. Rather than focusing on the successful result itself, Bubuhara became obsessed with the method behind it, a mindset Aruz recognized as a typical trait among nobles. Bubuhara then ordered Aruz to cast his magic properly, this time by visibly constructing a magic circle. Otherwise, he would immediately disqualify him. Though Aruz gave no verbal response, he thought to himself that the examiner was essentially requesting that he construct a magic circle. As an assassin, fulfilling a client's request was simply part of his duty. Accepting the demand, Aruz began creating a magic circle beneath his feet. He first formed the basic fireball circle as the foundation. It was a simple structure, one commonly taught to beginner magicians. Once the base had been established, he layered multiple incantations on top of it. He applied enhancements such as maximum projectile speed, maximum power output, and finally a form alteration that transformed the spell into a lance-type weapon. The students stared in disbelief as the magic circle expanded further and further. Some shouted in shock, asking just how enormous the circle was going to become. Multiple magic circles began interconnecting beneath Aru's, forming an incredibly complex magical structure unlike anything they had ever seen. After finishing, Aru's calmly asked Bobohara if that would satisfy him. Bobohara stood frozen in disbelief before finally insisting that Aru's was bluffing. He claimed the spell was undoubtedly filled with errors and would misfire the moment it activated. Hearing this, Aru's could only think in exasperation that the examiner truly refused to concede no matter what happened. Since Bobohara insisted, Aru's decided he would simply demonstrate true high-level magic. A massive weapon materialized in Aru's hand. He quietly chanted the name Gungnir before hurling it toward the target. The moment it launched, an overwhelming surge of energy tore across the ground, grazing the earth with terrifying force. His classmates recoiled in terror at the sheer destructive power of the attack. Even then, Bobohara struggled to accept reality. Though visibly shaken and stuttering, he still attempted to insist that Aru's was bluffing. Meanwhile, Aru's reflected that things could have become disastrous. At the very last second, he had overwritten the spell's formula to reduce its destructive force and prevent casualties. He wondered what the academy would have done if someone had actually been killed during the exam. Around him, the students continued murmuring in disbelief. Some asked if the others had truly seen that magic, while others questioned whether Aru's could really be a mere commoner. Aru's then turned toward the sweating and visibly nervous Bobohara and calmly asked if he had managed to get a good enough look at his magic. Bobohara, drenched in cold sweat, finally announced that examinee number 398, Aru's, had passed the first test. As Aru's walked back after his victory, someone suddenly stepped in front of him. Diluc greeted him with a smug expression, remarking that they had met again. Shortly afterward, the second test began. At the beginning of Chapter 8, after successfully passing the first examination, Aru's followed the remaining applicants down into the basement beneath the academy. The initial test had reduced the number of examinees from more than 400 to only around 100 students. Even so, Aru's felt that the examination had been so simple that nearly 300 people failing it seemed absurd. Once everyone arrived, Bobohara announced that they had reached the academy's underground dueling arena. Hearing this, Aru's quietly reflected on how surprising it was that such a massive facility existed directly beneath the school itself. Bobohara then explained that the second examination would focus on swordsmanship. This time, the students would fight one another using the weapons provided by the academy, allowing the examiners to witness the results of their training firsthand. He assured them that their weapons would be distributed shortly. Upon hearing that the next test involved swords, Aru's admitted inwardly that swordsmanship was not exactly his strongest area. However, before the matches officially began, Bobohara approached Aru's and tossed a sword directly at him. Bobohara mockingly remarked that Aru's had dared to ridicule him earlier during the first test. He sneered that Aru's must have foolishly devoted all his training to turning fire magic into nothing more than a cheap party trick. According to him, the world was filled with half-witted sorcerers who excelled at only one thing, and he hoped Aru's would thoroughly embarrass himself during the swordsmanship exam. Bobohara then glared directly at Aru's and declared that there could never be a commoner in this world who stood above a noble. In his eyes, such a thing simply must not exist. Aru's listened silently, thinking that Bobohara could not have been more mistaken about him. Yet at the same time, he found it oddly impressive that the man stubbornly clung to his intolerant beliefs even after witnessing Aru's overwhelming display of magic earlier. Soon afterward, Bobohara began announcing the match pairings for the second test. When he called out examinee number 398, Aru's, alongside examinee number 4, Diluc, both students stepped forward and entered the center of the arena. Diluc smirked as he greeted Aru's, saying he was pleased to see him again. He admitted that he had never expected to regain his honor so quickly after their earlier encounter. Above the arena, Bobohara watched the scene unfold with a snicker, openly looking forward to seeing the insolent peasant finally exposed for what he truly was. Observing both Diluc and Bobohara, Aru's quickly realized that the two were somehow connected. From rumors he had heard, there appeared to be a hidden backdoor into the academy, one where certain students could secure admission through bribery and influence rather than talent alone. Judging by their behavior, Aru's concluded that Bobohara and Diluc had most likely reached some sort of arrangement behind the scenes. Bobohara announced the start of the duel, signaling the beginning of the second test. The moment the match began, Diluc rushed forward while arrogantly calling Aru's a peasant. As Diluc swung his weapon, Aru's effortlessly dodged the attack. While evading, Aru's calmly analyzed the situation. Although the swords being used lacked actual blades and were designed to prevent fatalities, they were still heavy chunks of metal. If he underestimated Diluc too much or handled the fight carelessly, he could still end up seriously injured. Diluc taunted him, asking what was wrong and demanding that Aru's finally draw his sword. In Aru's mind, the provocation was weak and obvious, but he decided he would humor him. Since this was supposed to be a swordsmanship examination, it only made sense to draw his weapon as well. The moment Aruz unsheathed his sword, Diluc smirked confidently and charged straight toward him. From above, Bulbahara watched with a similar grin on his face. As Diluc attacked, Aruz narrowly tilted his head aside to avoid a strike aimed dangerously close to his eye. A few strands of his hair were sliced away in the process. Diluc raised his sword triumphantly while Bulbahara observed the exchange carefully. Although Aruz had clearly dodged the attack, something about the situation lingered in Bulbahara's mind. Diluc burst into laughter and mocked Aruz again, claiming his resolve was lacking. The reason quickly became apparent: Aruz's sword had broken apart. Aruz stared at the shattered weapon in mild disbelief. No matter how one looked at it, the previous exchange should not have been enough to break the sword. Almost immediately, he realized the truth. Diluc had known this would happen from the very beginning. He and Bulbahara had tampered with Aruz's weapon beforehand. It was certainly a crafty trick. Diluc proudly declared that he had studied swordsmanship since the age of 5 as he rushed forward again. Hearing this, Aruz briefly reflected on his own childhood. Around that same age, his father had taken him from the streets and begun training him as an assassin. Diluc continued boasting that a mere commoner like Aruz could never compare to him. As Diluc repeatedly swung his sword, Aruz calmly dodged and created distance between them. Diluc mocked him for retreating, claiming that Aruz must have lost his nerve after witnessing true swordsmanship. However, Aruz remained unimpressed. In his opinion, while Diluc certainly possessed enough skill to support some of his arrogance, his style was nothing more than textbook swordsmanship. In a real battle, such rigid techniques would have little practical use. Diluc suddenly laughed maniacally and shouted that Aruz should die, declaring that he would end him right then and there. As Diluc lunged forward recklessly, Aruz felt his irritation growing once more. The noble truly had a talent for getting on his nerve. Diluc declared that this was the perfect opportunity to demonstrate his superiority, but before he could finish his attack, Aruz moved. Using nothing more than the broken remains of his sword, he skillfully deflected Diluc's strike and sent Diluc's weapon flying out of his hand. Diluc froze in shock. In the next instant, Aruz swung the broken half of his sword and stopped its edge directly at Diluc's neck. Looking him straight in the eye, Aruz calmly stated that this was what it truly meant to end someone. If Diluc finally understood that feeling, then he should never carelessly speak such words again. Diluc swallowed nervously as fear overtook him, while Aruz simply turned around and walked away. As he left, Aruz reflected inwardly that one did not need an exceptional weapon to dominate an opponent. Even a broken sword without a blade could overwhelm someone completely if it carried genuine killing intent. Most people would instinctively freeze before it. Above the arena, Bulbahara gritted his teeth in frustration before begrudgingly announcing the result of the match. Diluc had been defeated, and the victor of the duel was Aruz. Although Aruz was relieved that the ordeal was finally over, he still questioned whether he would truly be allowed to pass the Academy's entrance exam. He had clearly proven his abilities, yet doubt still lingered in his mind. Regardless, the troublesome entrance examination had finally come to an end. At the beginning of Chapter 9, 5 hours after the entrance exam, laughter echoed through the Royal Academy of Magic's conference room as one of the staff members examined Aruz's credentials and remarked that he was certainly an interesting case. Several people had gathered around a table to discuss the applicant. Among them was the Academy teacher, Liera, who found Aruz especially fascinating. Despite his low social standing, he possessed remarkable magical ability, something she believed could not be ignored. Bulbahara, however, reacted with outrage. He declared the situation preposterous and argued that allowing a commoner into such a prestigious academy would damage its reputation. In his view, accepting someone like Aruz was completely unacceptable. Liera opposed him immediately, insisting that a student like Aruz could bring new life to the academy and that they absolutely should admit him. The disagreement between Liera and Bulbahara quickly grew tense, forcing their leader to intervene before the argument escalated further. Seeing that the discussion was going nowhere, the leader announced that they would settle the matter according to school regulations through a majority vote. Those in favor of Aruz's admission raised their hands, followed by those against it. After counting the votes, Bulbahara scoffed and declared that there were 4 votes supporting admission and 5 opposing it. To him, the matter was settled. He mocked the very idea of admitting a commoner into the academy, calling it absurd. Liera glared at him in frustration. In her mind, the opposing faction consisted of conservatives and members of the academy's old guard. Rumors claimed that some of them allowed wealthy students to enter through bribery, meaning they had the most to gain from preserving the current system. Refusing to give up, Liera pointed out that there was still one opinion left unheard. Bulbahara was caught off guard as she turned toward the headmaster and asked for his decision. In Liera's mind, everything now rested on this man. The headmaster of the Royal Academy of Magic, Duke, was once famous as a member of the Holy Knights, a peacekeeping force formerly under the royal capital's command. Though he operated as an underground sorcerer, his influence spread across the world. Duke silently examined Aru's credentials. When his eyes fell upon the surname Wilzard, a thought crossed his mind. It had been a long time since he had heard that name. Genos Wilzard was a legendary figure once renowned for his achievements as one of the Holy Knights. Stories of his strength were countless. Some claimed he had repelled an army of more than 100 sorcerers on his own, while others spoke of him slaying a colossal dragon with a single strike. Yet despite his fame, Genos had vanished without a trace one day. One popular theory suggested that the government had secretly assigned him to work within the underground world. Although many believed the rumor to be true, no concrete evidence had ever surfaced. As Duke continued staring at the document, he concluded that they would need to uncover the boy's true identity themselves. Duke and Genos had once been old acquaintances. The two had joined the Holy Knights at the same time and quickly became fierce rivals, each constantly refining their abilities in hopes of surpassing the other. After a moment of thought, Duke finally gave his response, declaring that he had reached his verdict. Meanwhile, far away in the underground city of Parakinos, Genos burst into proud laughter as he raised a glass high into the air, announcing a toast to celebrate Aru's success. Aruz, however, could only think about how he had somehow ended up in a members-only club after being dragged there by his father. He told Genos that the man simply wanted an excuse to drink. Genos denied it immediately, claiming that he genuinely wanted to drink together with his son. Still, Genos admitted that he was surprised. He never expected Aruz to actually pass the entrance exam for the Royal Academy of Magic. Yet the results clearly stated pass. A woman nearby chuckled and remarked that people never really know what life will bring. The thought of the Nighthawk becoming a student was amusing to her, and she was certain the higher-ups would practically fall from their chairs once they heard the news. Aruz recognized the woman as Mariana, a veteran guild assassin with far more experience than him. She had once been feared under the name Leopardess, though in recent years she had stepped away from the front lines and instead worked primarily as a spy. Since Genos had often been busy with missions, Mariana had helped raise Aruz over the years and was the one who taught him the fundamentals of magic. Genos laughed and declared that there was nothing wrong with relying on brute force. According to him, the era of flashy tricks had long since passed. Whether Aruz worked in the underworld or not, qualifications were now necessary. That, Genos claimed, was the trick to surviving in a peaceful world. Mariana agreed, pointing out that even their line of work had changed over time. Compared to the past, even Parakinos had become quieter. Aruz reflected on how different the city used to be. When he first joined the guild, Parakinos had been a completely lawless place where anything could happen. There was even a saying that some people entered the city and never left alive. Criminals fleeing the strict laws of the capital had gathered there over the years, transforming it into a breeding ground for crime. Out of that chaos, the organization known as the Guild had been born. Its purpose was to handle jobs far too dirty for the capital's knights to deal with openly. Due to its hidden ties to the government, the Guild was also known by another name, the Royal Warrant. Suddenly, the atmosphere inside the club shattered along with the walls themselves as an explosion rocked the building. Cracks spread through the bar, drawing everyone's attention toward the source of the destruction. A group of men stormed inside, loudly announcing that everything in the club now belonged to the Bruno family. They claimed to know the establishment was full of money and ordered everyone present to hand over their valuables and place them into bags. Aruz stared at the intruders and wondered if their leader was under the influence of something. The man seemed overly agitated and unreasonably fired up. As the thug continued shouting demands at the terrified customers, Mariana quietly muttered the words, "A peaceful world, huh?" Genos calmly told Aruz not to let it bother him. According to him, peace was fragile and bound to crack apart no matter the era. Even so, he noted that these men were particularly unlucky. They likely had no idea there were guild members gathered on the second floor. Scoffing, Genos identified them as one of the newer color gangs. Aruz sighed in annoyance, remarking that gangs like them kept causing trouble one after another. Color gangs were groups of delinquents scattered throughout the Black City, each operating under its own designated color and often dressing to match. Judging by their appearance, the Bruno family had apparently chosen blue as their symbol. Genos casually asked Aruz whether he needed help handling them. Aruz muttered that it was a nice joke before putting on his mask and declaring that he could deal with the situation himself. At the beginning of Chapter 10, a group of men stormed into the establishment, declaring that everything inside now belonged to the Bruno family. From above, Aruz calmly told Mariana to place the repair costs on his tab. Mariana simply replied that, for today, she would allow it. Aruz then stepped forward and leaped down from the second floor, landing smoothly on the ground floor. The intruders stared at him in confusion, wondering who he was and where he had come from, but quickly dismissed the thought and attacked. One of the men hurled a sofa at him, but Aruz effortlessly dodged it, causing the furniture to crash through a nearby window. Another thug rushed him with twin knives in hand, only for Aruz to evade him just as easily. Inwardly, Aruz noted that these men were far too strong to be ordinary civilians. He suspected the drugs they were using were enhancing not only their bodies but also their combat abilities. Excusing himself casually, Aruz landed on a nearby table and grabbed a bottle of wine. Despite the danger, he reminded himself that these opponents were still merely civilians, even if they were drugged. Enemies of this level were not worth drawing a weapon against. Using only the bottle, Aruz struck one of the men down before swiftly taking out another. He landed lightly on the floor as the remaining thugs stared at him in shock. One of them suddenly realized who he was, recognizing the mask and overwhelming strength. The man shouted that it had to be Nighthawk. However, he quickly tried to rally the others, insisting they should not lose faith in the power they had been granted. The word "granted" caught Aruz's attention. He immediately suspected that some larger organization was backing these men. The thugs then convinced themselves that Aruz could still be defeated since he was alone. One of them activated a magic circle and leaped high into the air, laughing as he prepared to crush Aruz beneath a powerful attack. But the moment he slammed into the ground, his confidence vanished. Aruz had disappeared. Without the thug realizing it, Aruz was already above him, hanging from the chandelier. Aruz mused to himself that some of these delinquents could actually use magic. Releasing the chandelier, he dropped directly onto the man's nape and coldly remarked that the thug was nothing more than a third-rate adventurer. Aruz then hurled the man straight into a glass wall, leaving him groaning in pain. Panic spread among the remaining attackers as they realized they were completely outmatched. Some shouted that they needed to retreat before they were killed. Watching them attempt to flee, Aruz sighed in annoyance. After causing all that trouble, they seriously believed they could simply run away. He had no intention of sparing them out of mercy. Instead, he intended to capture and interrogate them in order to uncover whoever was operating behind the scenes. Meanwhile, from the second floor, Mariana peeked through the shattered glass beside Genos. She wondered aloud whether a monster like Aruz could truly live the life of an ordinary student. Genos grinned and replied that perhaps she should ask Aruz himself. Still, even Genos admitted inwardly that he was beginning to worry about it too. At the beginning of Chapter 11, the morning after the incident in the Nightless City, the Royal Academy of Magic finally held its entrance ceremony. As Aruz adjusted the academy tie around his neck, he found it uncomfortably tight. Even now, he could hardly believe that he was actually about to attend school. After a long walk up the hill, Aruz passed through the academy gates, which were crowded with students and guests. Inside, the examinees had already taken their seats, and the atmosphere felt as extravagantly pompous as ever. While searching for his assigned seat, Aruz noticed Rua waving at him from a distance. He managed to remember her name just as he spotted Rina nearby as well. Rina shot him an irritated glare, making Aruz briefly wonder if the red-haired girl's name really was Rina after all. Without hesitation, she walked past him and bluntly declared that she would be taking his seat. Looking around at the massive gathering, Aruz remarked that there seemed to be far too many people present. Rina explained that the crowd did not consist solely of examinees. Among them were invitees, students who had been exempted from taking the entrance exam altogether. According to her, these individuals possessed both exceptional power and influential status, making them the true elite of the academy. Inwardly, Aruz reflected that many of the regular examinees were already high-ranking nobles. Realizing that there existed yet another class above them only made him feel even more out of place. At that moment, the atmosphere inside the hall abruptly shifted. A man wearing a cape entered the venue, and in an instant the air became heavy with awe, fear, and anxiety. The sound of a single pair of footsteps echoed throughout the hall, drawing everyone's attention toward the podium. The man introduced himself as Duke, the headmaster of the academy, and expressed his gratitude for the opportunity to welcome the new students. As Aruz observed him, he estimated Duke to be somewhere in his mid-40s, around the same age as his own father. Yet what truly stood out was Duke's overwhelming presence. One glance at the way he carried himself was enough to reveal how powerful a sorcerer he was. His body was built like steel, tempered through genuine combat experience. Even the magical energy flowing from him was smooth, stable, and refined. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Aruz acknowledged that there were indeed a few people here capable of fighting on a serious level. Duke then began his speech, speaking of the phrase, noblesse oblige. He explained that many people in modern times had distorted and misused its meaning. Originally, it referred to the duty of those blessed with magical power to devote themselves to protecting those born without it. Those words immediately caught Aruz's attention. He focused intently on Duke as the headmaster continued speaking. Although Aruz was seated near the back, he suddenly felt Duke's gaze fall directly upon him. To his surprise, Duke smiled. Aruz's eyes widened slightly. Duke continued by saying that these principles formed one of the foundations of the Royal Academy itself. Yet Aruz could not shake the strange feeling lingering behind that smile. Something about it felt deliberate, as though Duke knew more than he should. Unsure whether he was simply imagining things, Aruz remained quietly puzzled as the ceremony continued. Duke continued his speech by addressing the 150 students who had been chosen as individuals meant to protect the weak. He urged each of them to keep that responsibility in mind as they dedicated themselves to their studies at the Royal Academy. As Aruz listened, he recalled precept number 7, those born with the ability to wield magic must devote themselves to protecting those born without it. To someone like him, a commoner, the words sounded overly self-righteous. When Duke finished speaking, applause filled the hall. Many of the students were visibly impressed, praising the headmaster's presence and reputation. Some excitedly whispered that Duke had once been the Knight Commander. Others admired how prestigious the Royal Academy of Magic must be if it could appoint a former Knight Commander as its headmaster. Hearing this, Aruz finally understood why Duke had left such a powerful impression on him. Duke came from the Knights. The Knights and the Guild were essentially two sides of the same coin. The Guild existed to handle the tasks that the Knights considered too dirty or beneath them. With that in mind, Aruz found it unsurprising that someone like Duke would deliver such idealistic and overly noble speeches. Once the entrance ceremony concluded, the students moved on to their homeroom classes. The freshmen were divided into 5 classes, labeled A through E, and gathered in their assigned classrooms. Aruz found himself assigned to Class 1E. As the students settled into their seats, a familiar voice expressed surprise. It was Rena. She remarked that she had not expected to end up in the same class as Aruz. Meanwhile, Rua cheerfully exclaimed that it was great they would all be together again. Inwardly, Aruz noted that he had been running into the two girls constantly ever since the entrance exams. Before the chatter could continue, someone entered the classroom and sternly questioned whether the students had already forgotten the headmaster's words. The class immediately quieted down and returned to their seat. The woman introduced herself as Liera, their homeroom teacher for the next year. Observing her, Aruz felt somewhat relieved. He had worried all the academy instructors would resemble Bobahara, but Liera at least appeared to put effort into maintaining herself properly. Without wasting time, Liera explained that she would immediately introduce one of the academy's core systems, the point system. She instructed the students to check their student identification card. Aruz examined his own ID. It displayed his name, Aruz Wilzard, along with his class assignment, 1E. His SP total was listed as 0 points. His overall placement was ranked 150th out of 150 students, and his current rank was marked as F. Liera explained that SP served as a numerical representation of each student's academic performance. From that point onward, every student in the academy would compete against one another with their SP constantly on the line. At the beginning of Chapter 12, Liera explained that from that point onward, all students would be competing with their SP on the line. Her statement immediately startled the class. Noticing their reactions, Liera apologized and clarified her meaning. She explained that she was not encouraging the students to physically fight one another. Rather, SP served as a numerical representation of their academic performance, and their advancement within the academy would depend entirely on that number. She further revealed that students with high grades would gain access to various special privileges. Because of that, she encouraged everyone to do whatever they could to earn as many points as possible. Hearing this, Aruz realized that the system suited him fairly well. His only concern was whether nobles would receive preferential treatment within the academy. The thought reminded him of his match against Diluc and Bobahara's obvious favoritism during the exams. Even so, he admitted to himself that perhaps he was simply being overly suspicious. Regardless, his life as a student had already begun, and while there were a few things he still needed to get used to, he gradually adapted. Once he settled into the routine, student life turned out to be surprisingly comfortable. During the day, Aruz attended classes at the academy. At night, however, he continued traveling to Parakinos ever since the incident involving the Nightless City. His schedule had become incredibly busy. Meanwhile, the investigation into the recent attack uncovered traces of a narcotic known as DD on the man who had led the raid. The drug was infamous for producing overwhelming euphoria while simultaneously drawing out the user's latent combat abilities. Because of these effects, DD had earned a reputation as the most dangerous drug in history. Back in class, Bobahara lectured the students, explaining that adding to the formula allowed them to further develop the magic circle. As the lesson dragged on, Aruz found himself struggling to stay awake. Bobahara's dull, monotonous voice was practically lulling him to sleep. The professor continued speaking about completing the form, while the students struggled to keep up. One student quietly complained that Bobahara was speaking far too quickly to follow, while another muttered that the academy's lessons were on an entirely different level. Inwardly, however, Aruz disagreed. It was not that the material itself was particularly advanced. Rather, Bobahara simply had no real intention of properly teaching anyone. The realization left Aruz feeling deeply unmotivated. The thought of enduring 3 more years of lessons like this sounded utterly depressing to him. As the lesson dragged on, Aruz absent-mindedly gazed out the window. Bubahara immediately noticed and shot him an irritated glare. Resting a hand on his book, the professor smirked before announcing that the next question would be directed at the commoner sitting in the back. He ordered Aruz to come down to the whiteboard and solve the problem. As Aruz walked to the front of the classroom, he thought to himself that this was probably the first time Bubahara had ever singled someone out in class. It was obvious the professor had called on him after noticing that he had not been paying attention. Once Aruz stood before the board, Bubahara pointed at a complex problem and declared that they would make things interesting by placing Aruz SP on the line. If Aruz managed to solve the question, Bubahara promised to award him 100 SP. However, if he failed, he would lose 100 SP instead. In other words, Aruz would be placed on the fast track toward failing the year altogether. Aruz immediately realized what Bubahara was trying to do. The problem presented on the board was far beyond anything covered in their textbook. Bubahara clearly believed that none of the students could possibly solve it. To the professor's surprise, however, Aruz calmly picked up the chalk and began solving the problem without hesitation. The classroom fell silent as he completed the solution with ease. Bubahara stared at the board in shock, while Aruz casually asked whether the answer was acceptable. To Aruz, the question had been nothing more than a simple exercise. What truly pushed Bubahara over the edge, however, was Aruz's next remark. While solving the problem, Aruz had also noticed several flaws in Bubahara's magic circle formulas and corrected them along the way. The professor's expression twisted with barely concealed anger. Although Bubahara tried to maintain his composure, his emotions were written plainly across his face as he stiffly told Aruz to return to his seat. Back at his desk, Aruz checked his student ID. His SP had increased to 100 points, and his rank had risen from F to E. Meanwhile, murmurs spread throughout the classroom. Some students muttered insults under their breath, calling him a disgusting commoner. Others sneered that he had become arrogant simply because he had studied a little harder than everyone else. Aruz could feel numerous hostile stares directed toward him from every corner of the room. Still, he could not entirely blame them. Most of the nobles were probably unhappy about a commoner suddenly climbing above them in the rankings. At the beginning of Chapter 13, lunchtime arrived, and Aruz made his way to the Academy's underground cafeteria. The place was crowded with students, and the day's menu featured roast duck served with red wine sauce. Out of everything in his new school life, lunchtime had quietly become the thing Aruz looked forward to the most. The sheer amount of food served at the academy was honestly astonishing. As he ate, nearby students began whispering among themselves. One of them pointed him out, remarking that he was the commoner everyone had been talking about. Aruz glanced in their direction but paid little attention to the comment. He was already accustomed to this sort of treatment, and since he had no interest in making friends anyway, the hostility suited him just fine. Suddenly, Rina approached his table and politely asked whether the seats were free. Aruz replied that he did not mind. Rua immediately smiled brightly and announced that she would sit beside him, while Rina took the seat directly across from him. The moment Aruz looked at Rina's tray, his eyes widened in disbelief. He blurted out a question about the absurdly massive portion of food piled onto her plate. Rina looked at him blankly and asked if he was talking to her. Caught off guard, Aruz awkwardly asked who else she thought he could possibly mean. Rina calmly replied that there was nothing she could do about it. According to her, using one's brain consumed a tremendous amount of energy. Inwardly, Aruz thought she might be overcompensating a little. He also could not help noticing how well developed her figure was, his gaze unintentionally drifting toward her chest. Even so, the strange sense of familiarity he felt around her still lingered. He remained convinced they had met somewhere before, though he could not remember where. All he was left with was an irritating feeling of déjà vu. Meanwhile, the male students at another table glared enviously in Aruz's direction. Some complained that a commoner like him already had girls flocking to him in broad daylight, while others muttered that he should learn his place. Aruz could practically feel the jealousy radiating from the male student body. In all fairness, he understood why. Despite her sharp personality, Rina was undeniably attractive. Rua suddenly changed the subject and enthusiastically praised Aruz for how amazing he had been during the previous lesson. Curious, she asked where he had learned to use magic. Aruz casually brushed the question aside, telling her that it had nothing to do with her. Rua puffed her cheeks in annoyance and told him not to be so cold. She insisted that ending up in the same class had to be fate. Hearing that, Aruz fell silent for a moment. Contrary to her gentle appearance, Rua was actually rather pushy. At that point, Rina decided to get straight to the matter at hand. She explained that she and Rua intended to form a party for the purpose of taking on quests, and she asked Aruz whether he would be interested in joining them. Aruz questioned what kind of quests she meant. Rina explained that the Royal Academy of Magic accepted various requests from outside the academy. Students who completed difficult quests would receive large amounts of SP as rewards. That immediately caught Aruz's attention. Until now, he had assumed classes were the only way to earn SP. If quests provided another route, then depending on how he handled things, he might be able to skip some of the unbearably dull lectures while still managing to graduate. Rina continued by saying that completing quests was essential for students who wanted to graduate with high marks, and she revealed that she and Rua intended to begin taking quests that very day. Aruz quietly listened, realizing that Rina was every bit as serious and determined as her appearance suggested. Rua pulled out a stack of documents and explained that they contained the list of currently available quests. She enthusiastically told Aruz to let her know if any of them caught his attention. As Aruz examined the documents, he quickly understood the situation. The overwhelming majority of the quests involved either hunting dangerous monsters or capturing criminals. Every single one of them carried serious risks and would require the participants to put their lives on the line. Rua asked what he thought about them, but Aruz immediately told the two girls to give up on the idea altogether. In his opinion, attempting quests of that level with their current abilities would be nothing short of suicide. Rina frowned and questioned why he believed that. Aruz bluntly replied that sending the two of them on those missions would be like throwing a pair of sheep into a pack of wolves. The outcome was obvious from the start. Rina's expression hardened as she asked whether he was calling them sheep. Aruz answered that her complete lack of self-awareness was exactly what made the situation so concerning. Inwardly, he believed none of the quests were even remotely suitable for beginner sorcerers. One particular bounty hunt stood out as especially dangerous. If the girls became involved in something like that, they would undoubtedly be destroyed. For some reason, Aruz found himself unwilling to let that happen. Rina, however, grew visibly irritated. She snapped that Aruz did not know the first thing about either of them and had no right to judge their abilities. Turning to Rua, Rina firmly declared that the two of them would proceed with the quest anyway. She added that relying on a stranger in the first place had clearly been a mistake. Rua hurriedly apologized to Aruz for the tension and promised that she would make it up to him someday. As the two girls prepared to leave, Aruz silently watched them go. He was certain that both of them had their own personal reasons for taking on such dangerous quests, but whatever those reasons were, they had nothing to do with him. He already had more than enough to deal with because of his own work. At this rate, it seemed he would not have the time, or the interest, to play along with his classmates' ambitions. At the beginning of Chapter 14, Rina studied quietly while recalling Aruz's words. She clenched her teeth in frustration, thinking that he was an incredibly callous man. In her mind, she regretted ever reaching out to him. Determined to prove herself, she resolved that they would complete the quest on their own without relying on Aruz. Still, one question lingered in her thoughts. Aruz always disappeared immediately after classes ended, but where exactly did he go? Meanwhile, back in Black City, Aruz sat at a poker table. As the game continued, he calmly muttered, "Raise." The old man across from him answered with a confident call. The two revealed their cards. To the old man's shock, Aruz had won every chip on the table. Frustrated, the man slammed his cards down and cursed loudly, unable to understand how he had lost. He proudly declared himself the poker king of the nightless city, yet this black-haired boy had completely crushed him. Aruz, however, remained indifferent. In his mind, he decided to end the match there. Drawing too much attention to himself could interfere with his real work. Besides, the winnings would help cover his school fees. Suddenly, Saj spoke through communication magic, praising Aruz as unstoppable as always. He asked how things were looking on Aruz's side. Aruz replied that nothing unusual had happened so far. Saj remarked that Aruz was handling everything alone again, just as he always did. Inwardly, Aruz reflected on the nature of tonight's mission. Their task involved cracking down on a dangerous new drug spreading through Parakinos. Their targets had already been on alert for nearly an hour. The plan was simple. They would move the moment they confirmed a transaction. A moment later, Saj alerted him about a man standing up. Aruz observed carefully and noticed a briefcase being passed to another individual. Immediately, both Aruz and Saj became alert. In the next instant, Aruz appeared before the men and ordered them not to move. Pointing his gun at the briefcase, he declared that they would inspect its content. One of the men demanded to know what this was about, while another muttered that he had no idea what Aruz meant. Without warning, the man tossed the briefcase aside. Almost instantly, the case began melting away. Aruz narrowed his eyes. He detected no traces of magic and quickly realized it was an incendiary case designed for evidence disposal. To him, such a tactic was futile. Raising his gun, he calmly chanted, "Icicle bullet." The briefcase was immediately engulfed by sharp ice spikes, halting the destruction process. The men stared in shock. In Aruz's mind, a truly great sorcerer was someone capable of adapting to any situation. He then called out to Saj and instructed him to check the contents of the briefcase. Saj readily agreed. At that moment, one of the men gritted his teeth and activated magic, preparing to attack Aruz. Aruz quickly realized that the man himself was a sorcerer. That discovery made him understand that the deity issue was far larger than he had initially believed. The sorcerer stretched out his hand and shouted for Aruz to burn to death. Aruz sighed inwardly, wondering just how reckless someone had to be to use fire magic inside an enclosed space. The flames suddenly froze over. Then, before the man could react, Aruz appeared behind him and coldly declared the effort futile. Electricity surged through the sorcerer's body, instantly incapacitating him. To Aruz, even the strongest magic was meaningless if it never had the opportunity to activate. The remaining men in black suits panicked as they stared at Aruz. Some wondered who he really was, while others cursed and urged everyone to retreat immediately. Aruz understood that they had recognized the overwhelming difference in strength between them. Naturally, he had no intention of allowing them to escape. Using a gun there would only create unnecessary chaos, so instead he pulled out 2 enchanted cards and remarked that they would be more than enough. Activating both the Skull of Enchantment card and a durability enhancement, he chanted, Mass Multiplication. The cards multiplied instantly and struck the fleeing men with tremendous force, knocking them unconscious on the spot. As Aruz stood over them, nearby civilians erupted into cheers, praising him for catching the criminals and calling him a good kid. Inwardly, Aruz could not understand the commotion. From his perspective, they were merely carrying out their job, not putting on a performance. Then, suddenly, someone called out his name. Aruz's eyes widened in surprise. Standing nearby was Rua, calmly serving glasses of wine. At the beginning of chapter 15, Aruz's eyes widened when Rua suddenly approached him. Rua was equally shocked by the encounter. Remaining calm, Aruz discreetly removed his gloves before apologizing to Saj and asking if they could be excused for a moment. Saj looked confused and questioned whether Aruz was serious, especially since they were finally about to begin the interrogation. Aruz shot him a sharp glare and ordered him to leave immediately. Without another word, Saj quickly agreed and hurried away. Rua set her wine glass down and remarked that this was quite a surprise. She never expected Aruz to be hiding something like this. Internally, Aruz realized he had made a mistake. He never imagined he would encounter academy students in a place like this. Rua was turning out to be far more troublesome than he expected. The casino itself was especially dangerous, even by Parakino's standards, and certainly not somewhere an ordinary citizen would casually stumble upon. Aruz questioned what Rua meant by her statement, but Rua told him not to play dumb. She believed she had already figured out what he was doing there. Hearing this, Aruz began considering how he should handle the situation. He could not allow anyone to discover his ties to the guild, since leaking that information would create far too many risks in the future. Rua stepped closer and asked if Aruz was currently in the middle of an escort quest. Aruz was caught off guard by the question and looked puzzled. Rua asked if she was wrong, explaining that she assumed he was there to earn SP. In Aruz's mind, he realized his concerns had been completely unnecessary. Whenever he worked, he wore a mask to conceal his identity, so there was no way his current appearance could be connected back to the guild. Aruz admitted that Rua's deduction was correct. Rua was stunned, thinking about how rare escort quests were at the academy. Aruz decided it would be best to simply play along for the time being. Rua mentioned that she had heard the acceptance rate for escort requests was extremely low, which made Aruz seem even more impressive. Curious, she asked how he managed to get accepted. Aruz casually replied that he had simply gotten lucky. Rua stared at him in disbelief and told him to stop dodging the question. Aruz internally groaned, thinking he may have made the wrong decision by going along with her assumptions. Still, Rua continued pressing him about how he managed to get involved in the quest. Later, at the counter, Saj asked Aruz whether he was finished with the quest and told him to stick close while he was there. Noticing Aruz watching Rua, Saj smirked teasingly and whispered that Aruz really was a smooth operator. He added that Rua was a real cutie and assured Aruz not to worry, because he could leave the rest to Saj. Rua asked Aruz who he had been talking to, but before he could answer, Saj quickly excused himself, claiming he had work to do, before rushing away. Watching him leave, Aruz thought that it was about time Saj learned how to handle things on his own. He supposed he could allow it for now. Rua giggled and remarked that she never would have imagined Aruz meeting up with classmates in a place like this. Aruz glanced at her silently, thinking that he honestly would rather avoid getting too involved with Rua. Unfortunately, there was little he could do in the current situation. He decided he would simply answer vaguely, as long as he did not reveal too much. Aruz admitted that he was just as surprised himself. He never expected to run into a classmate there of all places. Rua explained that it was not only the bar she worked at. In total, she had around 7 different jobs and tried to balance several of them at the same time. Hearing that, Aruz was taken aback. In his mind, he could hardly believe she had said something so shocking as if it were completely normal. Curious, Aruz asked her a question. He wondered why a noble like Rua would need to work part-time jobs at all. Rua fell silent for a brief moment before quietly replying that it was because of family circumstances. Her family was not particularly well off, and paying for her own living expenses was the least she could do to help. Aruz's eyes widened at her answer. At that moment, he realized he had misunderstood something important. He had always assumed that anyone born into a noble family was guaranteed an easy and comfortable life. However, he now understood that reality was different. The lives of some one-star nobles were not so different from those of ordinary commoners. Aruz then asked if Rina knew about her situation. Rua immediately dismissed the idea, saying that Rina was far too serious. She could never bring herself to tell her. Aruz reflected on how different the two childhood friends were despite growing up together. Rina was strict and earnest, while Rua appeared far more adaptable and flexible. Trying to lighten the atmosphere, Rua pointed out that they were sitting in a bar and asked why Aruz was not ordering anything. Aruz calmly replied that he would take some warm milk instead. Rua looked surprised and asked whether he did not want a cocktail. Aruz firmly refused, reminding her that they were still minors. Rua smiled at his response and agreed that they really were minors after all. She jokingly called it a shame, mentioning that she had wanted to show him her cool side. It seemed the cocktail shaker would have to wait for another time. Hearing that, Aruz thought that Rua had a rather mischievous side to her as well. Compared to her impulsive counterpart, she seemed much tougher and more cunning than she let on. Aruz decided he would need to be careful around her. A short while later, Rua served him the warm milk and pointed out that she had already shared quite a bit about herself. Now, she said, it was Aruz's turn to talk. Aruz calmly took a sip of the warm milk and remarked that it was truly exquisite. He then casually asked for another cup. Rua stared at him blankly before accusing him of blatantly trying to change the subject once again. At the beginning of chapter 16, Aruz headed upstairs after school because someone had called for him. As he made his way there, he could not shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. When he finally arrived at the location, he found Rua and Rina waiting for him. Rua enthusiastically announced that starting that day, they wanted Aruz to become their coach. Aruz looked at them with tired eyes and immediately refused, pretending not to understand what they were talking about. Rina turned her gaze away and reminded him that he himself had said their current skill level made taking on quests too dangerous. Because of that, they believed the best solution was to have him train them instead. Inwardly, Aruz admitted that their reasoning made sense. However, the proposal had one fatal flaw: there was absolutely nothing in it for him. Turning his back on them, he remarked that he happened to be rather busy at the moment and suggested they ask someone else instead. Rua, however, refused to give up. She cheerfully insisted that the arrangement would not be bad for Aruz either. Curious, Aruz asked how that could possibly benefit him. Rua explained that the academy apparently held group exams where credits were on the line. If he helped them improve now, it could become useful for him later on. Hearing that, Aruz realized there was at least some benefit to the idea after all. Rua then begged him to help them, asking him to think of it as doing a favor for friends. Aruz rubbed his eyes in frustration, thinking to himself that the two girls were truly troublesome. Rua stood in front of him, pleading adorably for his help. After thinking it over, Aruz remembered that Rua had recognized him while he was working. It would not be good if she started disliking him now. In the end, he decided he might as well play along until the two eventually grew bored of the idea. Aruz finally agreed, saying that if they truly insisted, he supposed he could lend them a hand. Rua immediately asked if he was serious, and Aruz confirmed that he was. However, he warned them that he was not a very good teacher and that the methods he used could be somewhat rough. He asked if they were prepared for that. With complete determination, Rua declared that she was ready and fully intended to follow whatever the coach instructed. Aruz then shifted his attention toward the other girl, referring to Rina. Rina hesitantly responded that she had by no means fully accepted him yet, and whether or not she followed him would depend entirely on the quality of his lessons. In Aruz's mind, it seemed likely that Rina would be the first to give up, which would only make things more convenient for him if she did. He then announced that their training would begin immediately, or at least, that was what he wanted to say. For the first day, however, they would only have one task. The moment he finished speaking, Aruz suddenly kissed Rua, leaving her completely shocked. Rina's jaw dropped in shock, and she immediately demanded to know what Aruz thought he was doing. Beside her, Rua remained frozen in disbelief before stammering out a question of her own, asking Aruz why he had kissed her. Aruz calmly replied that Rua would understand soon enough. He warned her that the sensation might feel disorienting at first, but told her to endure it for the time being. Moments later, Rua suddenly winced in pain before collapsing to the ground, panting heavily. Confused and alarmed, she asked Aruz what exactly she was feeling, explaining that her entire body felt unbearably hot. She demanded to know what he had done to her. Aruz reassured her not to worry, explaining that he had merely shared a portion of his magical energy with her. According to him, her body temperature had risen sharply as her body absorbed the energy. He then revealed that this process was the first stage of their training. His plan was to amplify their magical energy capacities using his own power as a catalyst. Rua curiously asked how such a thing worked. Aruz explained that the most efficient method of increasing one's magical capacity was to receive magical energy from an outside source. As he spoke, a memory surfaced in his mind. The technique was known in the underworld as mana transference. He recalled undergoing the same training when he was only around 5 years old. The memory caused him to think back on his harsh training sessions with Mariana. He remembered hearing that the process was equally effective between sorcerers of the same sex, although his old man had insisted otherwise. Aruz cut off his own train of thought before telling the girls that it was supposedly more effective when performed between a man and a woman, and that they would simply have to trust him. In the back of his mind, he could still remember his old man casually reasoning that the method was naturally intended for a man and a woman. Rina immediately protested, declaring that she did not believe a word of it. She insisted that she had never heard of any training method like this before. Aruz responded that it was perfectly normal for her not to know about it. According to him, if an inexperienced sorcerer attempted mana transference, the process could become life-threatening. Meanwhile, Rua focused on the magical energy flowing through her body and seemed genuinely amazed by the sensation. Observing her reaction, Aruz noted to himself that she had adapted to his energy surprisingly quickly. That alone suggested Rua might actually possess considerable talent. Still unconvinced, Rina urged Rua to leave with her. She accused Aruz of using training as an excuse to steal a kiss and declared that she had known from the beginning that something about him was suspicious. In her eyes, Aruz was nothing more than a complete deviant. Rua, however, firmly refused to leave. Instead, she declared that she was staying because she now truly believed Aruz was incredible. If they continued training under him, she was convinced they would definitely grow stronger. Rina looked troubled by her friend's decision, but eventually sighed and admitted that she understood. Aruz then asked Rua if she was really certain about this. Rua confidently replied that everything would be fine. She believed that once they started seeing results, even Rina would eventually reconsider. After all, both of them were striving toward the same goal. Hearing that, Aruz silently wondered to himself whether things would truly proceed as smoothly as Rua believed. Aruz reflected that it had already been 3 days since he had taken on the role of Rua's coach. So far, their training mainly consisted of him sharing a portion of his magical energy with her once each day. During lunch break, the academy's underground cafeteria was bustling with students. As Aruz looked over the menu, he noticed that the day's special was maipo tofu. It was not a dish he had ever heard of before, so he assumed it was probably something commonly eaten among nobles. Inwardly, he found himself wondering what maipo even meant. Before he could think about it any longer, someone suddenly called out to him. Turning around, he saw Rua approaching. She quickly asked if she could borrow him for a moment. Aruz apologized and explained that he was in a hurry, asking whether it could wait until later. However, Rua grabbed hold of his clothes and insisted that it was an emergency before dragging him away. Aruz allowed himself to be pulled along as Rua hurried through the halls, already panting from the rush. Eventually, the two of them entered the bathroom and slipped into one of the cubicles. At that moment, Aruz realized the situation had become rather troublesome. Outside the stall, he could hear 2 male students talking. One of them insisted that he had just seen a girl enter the men's restroom. The other sounded confused and questioned what he was talking about, but the first student stubbornly claimed he had definitely seen it happen. Before Aruz could react further, Rua suddenly kissed him. His eyes widened in shock, and he stumbled backward onto the toilet seat. Even then, Rua continued kissing him until she finally pulled away. Aruz remained stunned while Rua panted heavily in front of him. Breathing unevenly, Rua demanded that he explain what was happening to her. She confessed that she desperately wanted him to give it to her again and that she could no longer endure the feeling. Aruz quickly told her to calm down, explaining that she was merely suffering from mana starvation. Confused, Rua asked what that meant. Aruz explained that the magical circuits within her body had been forcibly expanded by the magical energy he transferred into her. However, since the energy came from an outside source, it would not remain inside her body forever. As the energy naturally dissipated, it left her magical circuits feeling empty and unstable. He reassured her that there was nothing dangerous about it and that the symptoms would naturally fade within a day. However, if they performed another mana transfer, the discomfort would subside much sooner. Aruz further explained that the repeated cycle of filling and emptying the circuits was what gradually enlarged and strengthened them over time, making the process an effective form of training. After listening to his explanation, Rua quietly accepted it and simply replied that she understood. The steady dripping of the faucet echoed quietly throughout the bathroom. Inwardly, Aruz was surprised that the magical energy he had transferred to Rua had depleted so quickly. As Rua leaned in to kiss him again, he found himself even more shocked. He had been certain that he had already given her more than enough magical energy. That could only mean her magical capacity was far greater than he had originally anticipated. Just then, the sound of approaching footsteps reached them. Aruz immediately warned Rua that someone was coming and told her they needed to stop for the moment. However, Rua merely whined in protest before kissing him again. Aruz grimaced inwardly, realizing the situation was getting worse. She was no longer listening to him at all. Outside the stall, the second student told the first that, as expected, there was not a single girl anywhere in sight. The first student stubbornly insisted that they could not know for sure yet and suggested checking the stalls. Hearing that, Aruz sighed internally. It seemed they were dealing with an especially curious pair. Still, it was far too late to back out now. Raising his hand, he quietly chanted, "School of Entrancement, Visual Artifice." When the two students opened the stall, they were startled to find it apparently empty. The second student immediately remarked that the first must have simply been imagining things. Convinced there was nobody there, the pair eventually left the restroom. Aruz felt relieved once the two boys were finally gone. He was just about to tell Rua that enough was enough when she suddenly touched his face. Looking down at her, he saw Rua gazing back at him while sweating heavily, still straddling him without the slightest sign of embarrassment. At that moment, Aruz could only think to himself that this girl truly marched to the beat of her own drum. At the start of chapter 18, Rina was practicing alone at her residence within the training grounds. A magic circle appeared beneath her feet as she silently focused her mana, forming a fireball in her hand. Without hesitation, she launched it toward the target. The attack struck cleanly, and Rina happily declared that it was the best spell she had ever produced. It was not only the cleanest and most powerful fireball she had created, but also the fastest magic circle she had ever formed. At that moment, she became convinced that she had never needed Aru's help in the first place. Remembering Rua's face, Rina thought to herself that Rua should witness her achievement tomorrow. Meanwhile, another target was struck elsewhere. Deep beneath the Royal Academy of Magic, within an underground training facility, Rua and Aruz continued their practice. Aruz stated that they had already completed everything planned for the day. Rua, breathing heavily from exhaustion, begged him to wait and asked for just a little more training. Aruz looked at her and warned that overusing her magic would eventually come back to haunt her. Rua replied that it had already been 2 weeks since Aruz became her coach. Through that time, she had come to fully understand just how incredible he truly was. With someone as talented as Aruz dedicating so much time to teaching her, she felt she had no excuse for failing to produce result. However, her words faded away when she noticed that Aruz had already begun walking off. As he closed the door behind him, he simply told her not to worry because tomorrow she would see the results for herself. Later, Professor Liera announced to the class that they would be holding one of their monthly examinations. She explained that the results of the exam would drastically affect their SP, which in turn would influence both their future education and career prospect. Liera instructed everyone to display the fruits of their training. The students soon made their way toward the examination hall. One student asked if anyone knew what the exam would involve, while another confidently declared that he was fully prepared and intended to ace it. As they walked together, Rua asked Rina how she was feeling. Rina giggled and confidently answered that she felt unstoppable. She revealed that she had prepared a secret plan specifically for today's examination. Hearing about this secret plan immediately caught Aru's attention. He wondered if Rina had been following her own personal training routine. Rina then directly challenged Rua to a fair fight during the exam. She declared that she did not know what kind of brainwashing Aruz had put Rua through, but she intended to open Rua's eyes herself. Both Aruz and Rua silently looked toward Rina after her declaration. Later, once everyone gathered at the field, Aruz glanced toward the instructor. Liera explained that she would now go over the rules for this month's examination. Inwardly, Aruz felt relieved that Liera was serving as the proctor this time, rather than Bobohara. Unlike Bobohara, Liera was impartial, meaning they would not need to worry about any unfair rule-breaking. Liera instructed the students to direct their attention towards several targets positioned in the distance. She explained that the targets were special instruments known as testing stones. Whenever they were struck with magic, the stones would absorb the energy and convert it into a numerical score. Those scores would determine the outcome of the competition. As Aruz observed the devices, he realized that unlike the previous examination, where simply landing a hit had been enough, this test also measured the power behind each spell. Though the change was small, the difficulty of the exam had clearly increased. Afterward, the students stepped forward one by one to take their shot. Eventually, Liera turned toward Aruz and announced that the next participant was student number 2128, Aruz. At the start of chapter 19, Aruz stepped forward for his turn in the examination. Suddenly, someone called him a peasant. The voice belonged to Diluc. With a mocking grin, Diluc told Aruz that if he wanted to run away, now was his chance. He claimed that Aruz was probably panicking on the inside. Diluc further mocked him, saying that since Aruz had been spending so much time getting friendly with the one-star girl, he likely had little time left for his studies. Inwardly, Aruz thought that Diluc had not changed at all. Still, he admitted to himself that Diluc possessed more ability than many other worthless nobles. As the examination continued, students fired spells such as Fireball and Wind Edge at the target. Both attacks landed successfully, earning scores of 7 and 16 points respectively. Watching the results carefully, Aruz gradually gained a decent understanding of the overall strength of his classmates. Soon, student 2180 was called forward. Judging from the scores so far, most students appeared to be scoring somewhere between 5 and 20 points. Then Diluc stepped forward. Aruz and Rua silently watched as Diluc cast his spell. His attack struck the target and produced a score of 23 points. The students immediately burst into cheers, declaring it the new high score. Some even commented that it only proved how 3-star students like Diluc truly stood far above the others. As Diluc walked back, he deliberately passed by Aruz and scoffed at him. He asked whether Aruz had witnessed his magic properly. Diluc claimed that he could not allow Aruz to continue believing that the academy was merely fun and games. According to him, people like Aruz were simply unfit to stand at the top. He proudly pointed to the stars that symbolized rank, insisting that they were not merely decorative. Aruz calmly reflected on the situation. At that moment, Diluc held the highest score with over 20 points, making him an outstanding student by the academy's standards. Since Aruz wanted to avoid drawing unnecessary attention to himself, he concluded that he should probably keep his own score below 20 points. However, if he held back too carelessly and failed, it would defeat the purpose of attending the academy altogether. After some thought, Aruz decided to suppress his strength by what he believed was a reasonable amount. To him, it seemed like the perfect balance. He casually raised his hand and chanted, "Fireball." The spell launched toward the target and exploded upon impact. The entire area fell silent in shock. The score displayed was 185 points. His classmates stared in disbelief, muttering among themselves about what kind of monster the commoner truly was. Some wondered if Aruz was actually 10 times stronger than all of them combined. Rua looked at him with excitement and admiration, while Rina stood frozen in complete shock. As Aruz calmly walked back toward his classmates, he reflected that he had finally figured out the role he was meant to play there. Looking at the agitated expressions around him, he silently decided that from now on, he would simply act as someone 10 times stronger than everyone else. Nearby, Diluc gritted his teeth in frustration while Professor Liera quietly observed Aruz with interest. Rua then passed by Aruz, cheerfully telling him that it was now her turn. At that moment, Liera called out, "Student number 2182, Rua." At the beginning of chapter 20, Rua's name was called, and she stepped forward for her turn. Before moving into position, she glanced back at Aruz. Confused, Aruz asked what she was doing and told her to simply perform the way she always did during training. Rua remained silent for a moment before finally turning back and walking toward the target. As she faced the testing stone, a brilliant light flashed beneath her feet when her magic circle appeared. With confidence, Rua shouted, "Ice arrow!" An icy spike shot forward and struck the target directly. The students stared in amazement as the score appeared. 102 points. The entire class was stunned. Rua immediately turned toward Aruz with a bright smile, repeatedly exclaiming that she had done it. In Aruz's mind, however, he understood that the credit did not belong entirely to his coaching. The true reasons behind Rua's growth were her own talent and relentless effort. Even with access to mana transference, many people still failed to achieve genuine improvement. Nearby, Diluc cursed in frustration. Throwing a tantrum, he shouted about how a 3-star student like himself could possibly lose to lowborn scum. Even so, Aruz acknowledged internally that Diluc was not untalented by normal standards. Soon afterward, student number 2183 was called. At that moment, Rina silently thought that both Rua and Aruz should pay close attention to her performance. As her name echoed across the field, she stepped forward confidently. Aruz watched her carefully. Inwardly, he thought that the final student would likely be the most interesting one yet. He was curious to see how much Rina had improved over the last 2 weeks. Rina took her stance and declared that she was going all out. She then cast Burning Bullet magic. The moment Aruz saw the spell, he realized what Rina had meant by her secret plan. Burning Bullet was created by taking the simple fireball spell and layering an additional power amplification effect on top of it. The result was a highly effective combat spell commonly used in battles between sorcerers. Rina's Burning Bullet slammed into the target. However, after the impact faded, Professor Liera calmly announced the result. 32 points. Rina froze in shock. Aruz immediately understood the reason behind the outcome. When they first enrolled at the academy, Rina and Rua had been roughly equal in strength, with Rua only slightly ahead. But now, the difference between them had expanded dramatically. Rua's current power level had become more than 3 times greater than Rina's. Rina slowly collapsed onto the ground. To Aruz, the reason for her defeat was obvious: technique and mana capacity. Rina had not yet developed either of those areas enough to properly handle intermediate-level magic. She had tried to force herself beyond her limits and ended up overdoing it. Rua then walked toward Rina and gently suggested that perhaps they should both ask Aruz to coach them after all. She admitted that Aruz was the reason she had managed to raise her score so much. Rua sincerely believed that Rina could become stronger too if Aruz guided her. Rua extended her hand to help her up. However, Rina gritted her teeth angrily. She slapped Rua's hand away and shouted at her to shut up. Rina declared that she would prove she could become stronger on her own and warned Rua not to get carried away simply because she had widened the gap between them a little. Rua stood there dumbfounded while the surrounding classmates watched the confrontation in shock. Observing the scene unfold, Aruz could only sigh inwardly. To him, it looked like the situation had just become a troublesome headache. After the monthly examination concluded, Professor Liera praised the students for their efforts. She told them that each of them would likely experience the results differently. Some might feel proud of their accomplishments, while others could feel disappointed. However, she reminded them that they did not have the luxury of wasting time either celebrating or sulking. Instead, Liera urged everyone to think carefully about what they needed to improve before the next examination. She then announced that the rankings for the top 3 students in the class would be displayed for everyone to see so the others could learn from them. The students were left utterly shocked when they saw the rankings. Commoner had taken first place. The board displayed Aruz Wilzard, Class 1E 1100 SP, Rank D, first place out of 150 students. Aruz looked down at his ID and realized that he had earned another 1000 SP on top of the 100 points he already possessed. In addition, his academy rank had risen from E to D. He recalled hearing that students who reached rank B or higher were practically guaranteed advancement into the academy's second year. Around him, students murmured in disbelief, questioning the absurd amount of SP he had earned and the fact that he now stood at the very top of their entire year. Aruz calmly concluded that he should simply continue focusing on gathering as much SP as possible. Nearby, Diluc turned toward him with rage burning in his eyes. He clenched his teeth and cursed furiously. Rua, meanwhile, was also being praised and congratulated for her result. Quietly, she whispered her thanks to Aruz for his help. Rua had risen to second place within Class 1E. Her results showed Rua, Class 1E 350 SP, Rank E 18th place out of 150 students. However, despite her achievement, Rua sadly glanced toward Rina. Rina had finished in 32nd place with 200 SP, remaining at Rank E. From Aruz's perspective, it was obvious that the gap between Rua and Rina had widened even further. Even so, he acknowledged that Rina had performed very well on her own. The real issue was simply the methods she had chosen to pursue strength. Later that day, after classes ended, Aruz began walking home. Normally, he would head straight back to his small apartment in the slums. However, as he walked, he heard faint footsteps trailing behind him. He paused slightly and immediately realized that he was being followed. There were 2 people pursuing him. One presence felt inexperienced and amateurish, but the other clearly belonged to a professional. Aruz continued walking calmly until he eventually reached an isolated area with no people around. Only then did he stop and casually state that he already knew someone was following him and ordered them to come out. A familiar laugh answered him. Diluc emerged from the shadows with a snicker and mockingly asked Aruz how he was doing. Aruz silently looked at him. Diluc grinned madly and declared that he was feeling on top of the world because, as Aruz could plainly see, he was finally going to erase Aruz's disgraceful existence right there and then. Inwardly, Aruz realized that Diluc had completely lost his mind. It was obvious that he had come there with the sole intention of killing him. The overwhelming bloodlust pouring from Diluc felt unnatural. As Aruz observed him more closely, he noticed several abnormal symptoms. Heightened stimulation, physical augmentation, muscle strengthening, and above all, a berserk state of mind. They perfectly matched the effects of D2. Laughing maniacally, Diluc screamed for Aruz to die as he launched a violent attack. Aruz effortlessly dodged. Even so, Aruz felt slightly surprised. Diluc attacked again, but Aruz avoided the strike once more while quietly thinking that he had not expected D2 to already be circulating within the academy itself. That realization made him understand that the situation surrounding the drug was likely far worse than he had originally imagined. A moment later, Diluc slammed Aruz against a wall. Aruz simply stared at him calmly while Diluc grinned wildly. Defeating Diluc would have been easy for Aruz. However, if his instincts were correct, there was still another person hiding nearby. Before doing anything else, he needed to lure that hidden individual into the open. And for that to happen, Diluc first needed to take a quick nap. Diluc demanded to know what was wrong as Aruz continued dodging every attack. He mocked Aruz, asking if that was truly all he was capable of. Aruz merely stared at him before suddenly flipping into the air. Grabbing onto the bar above, he dangled there effortlessly while Diluc snickered in amusement. Meanwhile, Aruz remained calm. He thought there should still be one more person lurking nearby, and delaying his fight with Diluc until he located that individual would not be a problem. Activating his school of body strengthening magic along with ocular enhancement and thermal vision, he carefully scanned the surroundings. It did not take long before he found the hidden figure. The person was using advanced visual artifice magic. Without magic of his own, even Aruz would have struggled to see through it. Diluc suddenly shouted that it was time to finish things, hurling insults and calling Aru's worthless trash. Aruz effortlessly dodged again and replied that the only one getting trashed there was Diluc himself. In the next instant, Aruz grabbed Diluc by the head and slapped him hard, sending him crashing to the ground. How weak, Aruz thought coldly. His eyes shifted elsewhere as he sensed movement. The hidden individual was attempting to flee after sensing danger. Aruz had no intention of letting him escape. Pulling out his pistol, he fired several shots. A moment later, something dropped from above. Blood dripped onto the floor as black smoke spread through the area. The smoke soon transformed into a man whose face was filled with disbelief. Despite Aruz being only a student, he had still managed to see through the man's magic. Clutching his wounded hand, the man glared at Aruz while Aruz calmly aimed the pistol back at him. Aruz questioned the man about his objective and demanded to know why he had been tailing him. The man only snickered and replied that he could not answer. When the man suddenly pulled out a dagger, Aruz was surprised that he still intended to fight back. The man shouted that Aruz could ask him everything once he met him in hell. Before Aruz could react, the man drove the dagger into his own neck. Aruz stared in shock as blood burst from the wound and the man collapsed lifelessly onto the floor. He quickly realized the man had been terrified of being interrogated. Such loyalty was unusual. At first, Aruz had assumed the man was merely one of Diluc's bodyguards, but now he suspected the truth was different. The man was likely there to monitor Diluc after he had taken the drugs. Then Aruz's eyes suddenly widened. He remembered his old man once telling him that Aruz himself should already have some vague awareness ever since the incident 3 years ago. Looking at the dead man's hand, Aruz recalled another thing his old man had said, that the world was gradually drawing closer to peace. But upon seeing the symbol engraved there, Aruz found it impossible to believe. That mark should have been eradicated 3 years ago. The reverse crown. The next day, Aruz could no longer remember when it had all started. However, if Rua was truly serious about becoming stronger, then there was little he could do to stop her. The sound of Rua gasping for air echoed through the empty classroom as she lay on the floor trying to recover. Aruz asked whether she had finally calmed down, and Rua replied that she had. She apologized for making Aruz go through all of that, but Aruz simply told her not to worry about it, explaining that this was merely the optimal method. Rua admitted that Aruz was right. No one had noticed anything suspicious. Aruz explained that it was because he had used magic to clear everyone out of the area. Finding them at that moment would have been extremely difficult for anyone. In Aruz's mind, performing mana transference with Rua in an empty classroom after school had already become part of his daily routine. After a brief silence, Rua told Aruz not to think too badly of Rina. Aruz asked what she meant by that. Rua explained that Rina was different from her. Unlike Rua, Rina had always been a pure-hearted girl who strongly despised anything she considered immoral. Even the slightest wrongdoing was something Rina could never overlook. Aruz inwardly found that quality admirable. It was not as though he truly hated Rina. Although he did find her personality rather irritating, that was no different from many of the people he often found himself surrounded by, so he had long since become accustomed to it. Rua then asked Aruz if he remembered the Oswald incident from several years ago. Aruz immediately replied that he did. Internally, he had not expected Rua to bring up that particular name. The Oswald incident had occurred 3 years earlier in the royal capital of Misgard and was regarded as the single most heinous event ever recorded in the nation's history. Back then, at the guild safe house, Saj had informed everyone that they had received an urgent request directly from the government, the same people as before. A radical extremist group with intense hostility toward the nobility had launched an operation during a party hosted by the prestigious 3-star Orwald family. At the time, a sorcerer affiliated with Reverse Recrown had taken the guests hostage. Around 80 nobles were being held captive. Their demand was simple yet impossible. They wanted the complete abolition of the noble system that governed the country. Saj had bluntly stated that there was no chance the government would ever consider agreeing to such demands. That was precisely why they had been ordered to eliminate the threat. With that, Saj urged everyone to move out immediately and finish the operation as quickly as possible. The organization known as Reverse Recrown sought to abolish the nobility and punish those who oppressed the weak through tyranny. During the Oswald incident, 80 people had been taken hostage, and 70 of them were ultimately slaughtered. Even in the present day, many people were still too terrified to openly speak about the tragedy. Rua then revealed that Rina had been one of the victims of the Oswald incident. Aruz was genuinely surprised by this revelation. At that moment, he finally understood the strange sense of déjà vu he had felt when he first met Rina. It must have been because they had already crossed paths 3 years earlier during that incident. Rua explained that someone had saved Rina that day, a man whose identity she never learned. The reason Rina worked so desperately hard to become stronger was because she wished to get closer to that mysterious man. As Rua spoke, fragments of Aruz's memories slowly resurfaced. Deep down, He realized he already knew the identity of the man who had saved Rina. It had been himself. Suddenly, Aruz informed Rua that it seemed he had received an urgent work call. Rua asked whether he had something important to do, and Aruz replied that he did. He apologized, saying he could not stay any longer. Rua simply smiled and told him not to worry about it. After all, despite being so busy, Aruz still took the time to coach her personally. Meanwhile, Aruz's thoughts grew serious. The clashes between the organization and whoever was backing Didi had been escalating more and more lately. Without another word, Aruz suddenly leapt out the window, startling Rua in the process. As he moved swiftly through the city, Aruz thought to himself that today's battle looked like it would be tougher than usual. At the beginning of chapter 24, Aruz had the uneasy feeling that things were going to become dangerous that night. Standing on a rooftop overlooking the port, Aruz wore his Nighthawk suit while Saj remained beside him. The cold night air swept across the harbor as Aruz asked Saj for a report on the situation. Saj welcomed him back and explained that nothing unusual had happened so far. There had been no movement yet. However, information had been extracted from the members of the Bruno family they had captured earlier. According to the intel, a deal was scheduled to take place that very night, and the customer involved was Reverse Recrown. Aruz frowned at the revelation. He could not understand how Reverse Recrown had resurfaced after all this time. Still, he realized that this mission might provide a valuable opportunity to uncover more details about the organization. Aruz warned Saj not to lower his guard. There was a real possibility that the situation involving Reverse Recrown could escalate into an all-out war before the night was over. Saj looked surprised and asked whether Aruz was being serious. Aruz explained that while the organization's total forces were nowhere near a match for the guild, Reverse Recrown was still extremely dangerous. Most of its members were commoners who harbored deep resentment toward the nobility, and desperate people with nothing to lose often made the most troublesome enemies. Even so, Saj remained optimistic. He remarked that as long as Aruz was there, everything would surely be easy enough to handle. Aruz silently wished he could believe that as well. During their prime, Reverse Recrown had managed to kill nearly 1/3 of all guild members. Underestimating them would be a fatal mistake. Suddenly, Saj informed Aruz that they finally had visual confirmation of the target's arrival. However, he immediately sounded confused. The person he was looking at seemed far too young to be involved in a drug deal, and to make matters stranger, the girl was wearing a school uniform. At that moment, Aruz's eyes widened in shock. That idiot, he thought bitterly. Of all times, she had to show up now. The girl Saj had spotted was Rina. Meanwhile, hidden nearby, Rina observed the man she had been tracking. She was certain he was her target. Bakraja Ackerman, a criminal wanted for intimidation, assault, theft, and 5 other charges. As she watched him carefully, she remembered Aruz warning them to stay away from Ackerman. He had told them that attempting to confront someone like him at their current level would be tantamount to suicide. But Rina refused to believe that. In her mind, the magic she had trained so hard to master should work perfectly fine in a real battle as well. Ever since the Oswald incident 3 years earlier, she had dedicated nearly every moment of her life to studying magic and swordsmanship. Her goal had always been the same, to become closer to the man who had once saved her life. Although she had never seen his face back then, she still remembered how he had rushed into danger faster than anyone else. In Rina's eyes, any sorcerer capable of such a feat had to possess strong ties to the government. Rina believed that if she became stronger as a sorcerer, then one day she would surely meet the man who had saved her again. That belief was what continued to drive her forward. It was the reason she endured such harsh and unforgiving training for so many years. And yet, despite all of that effort, the results still felt insufficient. At times, Rina found herself doubting everything she believed in. She wondered whether she was truly getting any closer to the person she admired so deeply. Even so, she refused to let all the hard work she had poured into her training go to waste. She was determined to prove that her efforts meant something. If she managed to capture this man, she would earn 2,000 SP in a single mission. With that achievement, she could even surpass Rua in the rankings. With those thoughts motivating her, Rina continued following Bakraja Ackerman through the street. However, before long, she began to feel uneasy. Ackerman had already walked far more than she expected. As she pursued him deeper into the area, Rina suddenly froze in shock. There was no one there. Ackerman had vanished without a trace. Confusion spread across her face as she desperately looked around, unable to understand where he had gone. Then, to her horror, she heard laughter coming from directly behind her. Rina's eyes widened instantly. 2 men slowly approached her, grinning as they asked if there was anything they could help her with. The color immediately drained from Rina's face. At the beginning of chapter 25, Rina found herself cornered not by 2 men, but by an entire group. A magic circle formed beneath her feet as she attempted to cast her burning bullet spell, but before she could fire it, one of the men kicked her hard. The man standing before her mockingly apologized, saying she was far too slow. He struck her again, causing her to collapse painfully onto the ground. Gasping for air, Rina struggled to sit up. Even so, she tried once more to chant Burning Bullet, but the man kicked her in the stomach before she could finish. The blow knocked the air out of her lungs completely. As she lay there helplessly, Rina wondered if this was truly how everything would end. All the effort and training she had endured felt meaningless in that moment. One of the men reached down and touched her face, grinning as he commented that the fear in her eyes excited him. Another man laughed, saying he could not wait any longer and that it was their lucky day to get their hands on someone as valuable as her. Ackerman interrupted them, reminding the others why they had come there that night. Rina had seen the location of their deals, so they had to make sure she was dealt with properly. In the meantime, he cruelly told them to treat her nicely. Terrified, Rina felt tears stream down her face. Weakly, she whispered for help. One of the men reached toward her, but suddenly the sound of crackling lightning filled the air. The man was instantly electrocuted. Rina stared in shock while the others quickly became alarmed. Confused voices rang out as the men tried to figure out what had happened. Some shouted that they were under attack and ordered everyone to watch the perimeter. Then another man suddenly cried out in pain. At that moment Aruz appeared. Unable to move properly, Rina watched as Aruz fought through the men one after another. Questions filled her mind as she witnessed the overwhelming difference in strength. One of the men yelled that someone needed to stop Aruz immediately, but before he could even finish speaking, Aruz vanished from sight. In the next instant, he had already dashed over to Rina. Her vision blurred and she sensed something approaching. Instinctively, she shut her eyes, expecting another attack. However, when nothing happened, she slowly opened them again and froze in surprise. Aruz had picked her up and was carrying her in his arms. Confused and stunned, Rina could only stare at him while the men glared furiously at the newcomer, demanding to know who he was. They cursed Aruz as the tension in the area continued to rise. At the start of chapter 26, the men continued cursing Aruz as he carried Rina in his arms. One of them mocked him, saying that anyone willing to pick a fight with the Bruno family must have a lot of courage, while the others drew their weapons. In response, Aruz could only think to himself that the situation had become a real nuisance. Rina looked up at him and asked why he was there. Aruz casually replied that it was nothing special. Like her, he was simply carrying out a quest from the academy. Deep down, however, Aruz realized that Rina might have recognized him from 3 years ago as Nighthawk. To avoid unnecessary complications, he concluded that it was better not to wear the mask for now. As Aruz assessed the situation, he counted 11 hostiles, with 3 of them capable of using magic. Rina watched in disbelief as Aruz suddenly pulled out a gun and fired. One by one, the men fell to the ground. Aruz remarked internally that it was quite an impressive lineup for a mere group of thugs. The remaining men quickly retaliated by drawing rifles and opening fire while shouting curses at Aruz. Calmly, Aruz told Rina to hold on tight before activating his magic from the School of Enchantment. Durability Enhancement. With enhanced speed and resilience, he dashed straight through the hail of bullets. Rina stared in shock, unable to believe what she was seeing. She wondered if they were actually flying. Even the enemies were confused, with one of them shouting in disbelief about what kind of monster Aruz was. Another man reported to Ackerman that they could not land a single hit on him. Ackerman narrowed his eyes as he looked at Aruz's black coat. He claimed the figure seemed familiar. One of his subordinates asked if he knew who Aruz was, and Ackerman immediately declared that there was no doubt about it. The man before them was the legendary assassin. However, before he could utter Aruz's code name, Aruz instantly closed the distance between them and coldly told him not to waste his breath. At the same moment, Aruz pulled out a pistol and fired. Ackerman was struck before he could react, blood spraying into the air. The remaining men groaned in pain as bullets tore through them one after another. As another enemy collapsed, Aruz realized that there were indeed people capable of recognizing him even without his mask. He made a mental note to be more careful moving forward. Still, he considered the fight decent exercise. Rina stared at him in complete shock and asked who he really was. Watching him defeat everyone alone was far beyond anything normal. Aruz, however, reflected silently that answering such a question was not simple. He especially wanted to avoid mentioning that he had been the one who saved her during the Oswald incident 3 years earlier. In his mind, the strange admiration Rina held toward the underworld was dangerous and would only lead her down a bad path. As Rina slowly approached him, she hesitantly wondered if perhaps they had already met before. But before she could finish her sentence, her eyes widened in alarm. A massive explosion suddenly erupted nearby. Reacting instantly, Aruz grabbed Rina and carried her to safety. From the smoke, a voice casually remarked in surprise that Aruz had actually dodged the attack. Soon after, a man emerged from the destruction, declaring that Aruz finally seemed worthy of killing. The moment Aruz noticed the emblem marked on the back of the man's hand, he immediately recognized him as a member of the Reverse Recrown. At the start of chapter 27, the mysterious man stood before Aruz and remarked that his movements were far from normal. Narrowing his eyes, the man demanded to know who Aruz really was. Ignoring the question, Aruz turned to Rina and firmly told her to leave the area immediately. Rina hesitated and stuttered that she could still fight. Although the enemies had overwhelmed her earlier, she believed she could still help somehow. Before she could finish speaking, however, Aruz raised his hand, signaling her to stop. Rina stared at him in confusion, wondering why he was stopping her. In Aruz's mind, though, the answer was obvious. No matter how one looked at it, this opponent was far beyond anything Rina's magic could even scratch. The strength radiating from the man surpassed all the previous thugs combined. There was no doubt that this sorcerer was a high-ranking member of Reverse Recrown. At that moment, Saj contacted Aruz and asked what was happening, saying he had heard a massive disturbance nearby. There was no way he could simply remain on standby. Aruz immediately ordered Saj to take Rina and run. Saj confidently replied for him to leave it to him. Aruz then asked Rina if she understood. Unable to respond, she simply stared at him. Aruz returned the look with a stern glare. Rina bit her lip before finally closing her eyes in resignation. Soon after, Saj swiftly carried her away from the battlefield. The man watched calmly and told Aruz to relax, claiming he had no interest in small fry like them. He explained that he had merely come there to unload some drugs onto a new client, yet instead he had encountered someone far more interesting. Grinning with excitement, the man admitted that this was his first real showdown since regaining his freedom, and he hoped Aruz would make the fight entertaining. A magic circle suddenly appeared beneath the man's feet, and without hesitation, he launched an attack at Aruz. Aruz dodged instantly and realized that the enemy possessed incredibly fast activation speed. This opponent was clearly on an entirely different level from the thugs before. Understanding the danger, Aruz decided it would be best to end the battle quickly. Determined to finish things in a single strike, Aruz drew his gun and activated School of Enchantment Magic, Projectile Acceleration. The bullet struck the man directly, and for a moment it seemed as though he would collapse. Instead, the man laughed. Aruz was caught off guard as the man grinned and remarked that the attack actually hurt. Aruz quickly realized what had happened. Just before impact, the man had coated his forehead with ice magic to prevent the shot from becoming fatal. The man smirked and declared that he finally remembered those movements and technique. There was no mistaking it anymore. He called Aruz a traitor, Nighthawk. Aruz silently noted that the man knew his name. The sorcerer sneered, mocking Aruz for siding with nobles despite being a commoner himself. To him, Aruz was nothing more than a dithering backstabber. Laughing wildly, the man proclaimed that he had been waiting for this day. Finally, he would get the chance to kill Nighthawk. The man unleashed a barrage of attacks powerful enough to send nearby trailers crashing to the ground. Thick smoke filled the area as destruction spread everywhere. Yet from within the smoke, Aruz calmly emerged unharmed. Inwardly, Aruz thought that traitor was a rather unfair way to describe him. As he rolled his sleeves up to his elbows, he reflected on how most members of Reverse Recrown were magic-using commoners, just like himself, people born from the so-called cursed bloodline. To them, cooperating with nobles was an unforgivable betrayal. The man then brushed aside his hair and revealed a scar, asking Aruz if he remembered the wound. He revealed that Aruz himself had inflicted it 3 years earlier. Aruz immediately understood. If the injury dated back 3 years, then this man must have survived the Oswald incident. The sorcerer's expression twisted with hatred as he swore to repay that humiliation 1,000-fold. Suddenly, Aruz sensed danger as another magic circle formed beneath the man's feet. This circle was unlike the others before it. Aruz immediately recognized it as a forbidden art. Void's Edge, Glacial Raiment. At the start of Chapter 28, Aruz carefully observed his transformed opponent. The enemy stood before him clad in ice-like armor before suddenly charging straight at him. As he rushed forward, the man taunted Aruz, asking if he truly believed he could survive such an attack. Inwardly, Aruz analyzed the situation calmly. Normally, the human body was never meant to endure prolonged contact with ice. Even with magical reinforcement, there were limits to what flesh could withstand. The only explanation was that this man possessed an exceptionally resilient body far beyond ordinary humans. The enemy attacked fiercely while shouting for Aruz to remember the name, Joch the Immortal, declaring himself to be the one who would finally end Nighthawk. During the assault, Aruz's gun was knocked from his hand. Joch immediately mocked him, sarcastically asking if he had lost his precious weapon. However, Aruz simply looked back at him and calmly asked whether Joch knew why he used a gun in the first place. Aruz revealed that the reason was simple. He did not know how to hold back. As Aruz raised his hand into position, Joch scoffed at the statement and called it nonsense. But in the next instant, invisible attacks struck Joch's body. The ice covering him shattered and fell away piece by piece. Joch grunted in pain as another barrage slammed into him one after another, stripping the ice spikes from his body completely. Inside his mind, Joch panicked in disbelief, unable to understand what was happening. Aruz, meanwhile, thought calmly that the attack was not truly magic at all. What he had unleashed were incomplete clumps of mana that had not fully formed into spells, allowing him to create a surprise attack. However, such a technique was only possible when there was an overwhelming gap in skill between opponents. Aruz slowly raised his hand again, causing Joch to tense in fear. Before the man could comprehend what Aruz intended to do, a gigantic fireball suddenly formed high above the battlefield. Aruz calmly chanted, "Fireball." The enormous sphere of flames crashed down upon Joch instantly. A deafening explosion shook the area as Joch's screams echoed through the night. When the smoke finally cleared, Joch could be seen collapsed on the ground, desperately gasping for air. Even so, Joch glared at Aruz hatefully and swore that he would make him pay. Aruz merely stared silently as a dragon suddenly descended from the sky. Joch climbed onto the creature and shouted that he would repay Aruz 1,000-fold before escaping into the night. Aruz watched the dragon soar upward before quietly muttering that he doubted Joch would get the chance. At that moment, another magic circle appeared. A massive spear-like weapon materialized in Aruz's hand as he uttered a single word. "Gungnir." Without hesitation, Aruz hurled the divine spear toward the fleeing enemy. Joch's eyes widened in horror as the weapon struck him directly. His agonized scream echoed across the night sky as the dragon continued flying away. As silence slowly returned to the battlefield, Aruz reflected on the unexpected turn of events. He had never imagined that a member of Reverse Recrown would once again appear and wreak havoc. To him, it was a sign that change was approaching the gates of Black City once more, and it was certainly not the kind of change anyone would welcome. At the beginning of Chapter 29, life gradually returned to normal before anyone even realized it. Back in their daily routines, Aruz found himself seated at a tavern counter alongside Genos. During their conversation, Genos remarked that he now understood the situation clearly. Reverse Recrown had returned to action once again. Aruz asked whether he should leave school and return fully to guild work. Ever since hearing that Didi had begun moving around Black City again, the thought had lingered in his mind. The guild was a combat organization built around the strength of a select group of elite sorcerers, and considering its relatively small number of members, Aruz's absence left a significant gap in their forces. However, Genos immediately dismissed the idea. He told Aruz that there was no need for him to quit school and that he should continue prioritizing it just as he had been doing. Although Aruz attempted to object, Genos assured him that there was nothing to worry about. After a long time away from the front lines, Genos had personally decided to return to field work for this case. Aruz was genuinely surprised. He could hardly remember the last time the old man had gone out into the field himself. Wondering just how serious the situation truly was, Aruz asked if the mission was really that large in scale. Genos casually brushed it off, claiming it was not such a big deal. He joked that if he never exercised anymore, he would eventually grow rusty. Aruz quietly looked at him while thoughts about Reverse Recrown filled his mind. He wondered why the organization had suddenly chosen to reveal itself again. Still, he understood that someone at his level would never be privy to the larger reasons behind their actions. All he could do was carry out whatever missions he was assigned. Genos then shifted the topic and asked Aruz whether he had been enjoying school. After briefly thinking about Rena and the good food there, Aruz admitted that it was all right. Hearing that answer, Genos smiled warmly and said he was glad to hear it. He then wondered aloud why Aruz had never talked about his school life before. Personally interested in hearing more, Genos wrapped an arm around Aruz and called for Mariana to join them for drinks as well. He declared that they would sit there and hear everything the boy had to say. Looking back on it later, Aruz realized it was probably the first time he had ever spoken at length with Genos about something unrelated to work. The following day at school, Rua enthusiastically called out to Rena. She tried convincing her that since Aruz was taking time out of his busy schedule to train them, Rena needed to greet him properly. Flustered, Rena stammered that she already knew that much. Aruz silently watched the two of them. With an embarrassed expression, Rena awkwardly told Aruz that she looked forward to working with him. Turning her gaze away, she even referred to him as Coach Aruz. Aruz found the situation amusing. Not long ago, Rena had strongly opposed the idea of training under him, yet now her attitude had changed completely. He assumed the incident at the docks had forced her to realize the limits of trying to improve on her own. Aruz calmly stated that he did not particularly mind taking on one more student, but he asked if Rena was truly prepared to follow through with the training. Rena's face immediately turned red as her eyes widened. Nervously, she answered yes and insisted that she understood. In her mind, she convinced herself that she simply had to endure whatever came next. Determined, she stood directly in front of Aruz and tightly closed her eyes. Aruz stared at her in confusion, sensing that Rena had fundamentally misunderstood the situation. To her complete shock, Aruz merely placed a lollipop into her mouth. Rena blinked in surprise as sweetness spread across her tongue. Aruz explained that it was a magic-infused candy commonly used in the underworld. By licking it, one could experience an effect similar to mana transference, though much weaker. Because of its reduced stimulation, it was generally intended for beginners learning magic for the first time. Aruz further explained that Rina's latent magical capacity was lower than Rua's, which was why they would begin her training with the lollipop instead. Rina fell silent. Seeing her trembling in embarrassment, Rua walked behind her and asked with concern if she was alright. Rina shakily asked why Aruz insisted on toying with a maiden's heart like this. Trying not to laugh too hard, Rua awkwardly reminded her that she had promised to listen to Aruz's instructions properly. Suddenly, however, Aruz's expression became serious. Rua immediately noticed the change, and asked what was wrong. All three of them turned toward the doorway. Standing there was a white-haired man casually leaning against the entrance. He smirked briefly before turning around and walking away. After watching him leave, Aruz calmly told the girls it was nothing and instructed them to return to training.